to quiet Chronicles. Thomas Aquinas is remembered as one of the great minds of the Middle Ages, but his life did not begin as the life of a scholar sitting safely among books. He was born into a noble family that expected him to rise through the old religious order, perhaps to command one of the most powerful monasteries in Italy. Instead, he chose a poor preaching order his family considered beneath him, endured pressure meant to break that choice, and became the monk whose arguments would shape Christian thought for centuries. His story is not only the story of a man trying to prove God, it is the story of a world where faith and reason were not always enemies, where Aristotle entered the classrooms of Paris like a dangerous guest, where universities became battlegrounds of ideas, and where a quiet Dominican friar tried to arrange creation, knowledge, morality, and divinity into one vast order. Before the history begins, take a moment to let the day settle. If you enjoy these long-form histories, a like and subscription helps Quiet Chronicles keep bringing out new stories each week. And if you are listening from somewhere in the world, let us know in the comments where you are and tell us what person, topic, story, or era you would like covered next. For now, the road begins in southern Italy, in a fortress world of family ambition, imperial power, and religious expectation, where a child named Thomas was born before anyone knew how far his thoughts would travel. Chapter 1. A child of Roccasecca. Roccasecca stood in the rugged country of southern Italy, not far from the great roadways that connected Rome with the lands of the south. It was not a place removed from power, even if its hills and stone walls could make it seem distant from the courts where decisions were made. In the early 13th century, that part of Italy lay within a world divided by old loyalties and repeated conflicts, where noble families often had to measure their fortunes against both the Pope in Rome and the emperor who claimed authority across much of Christendom. A child born there did not enter a quiet, private life. He entered a landscape of family calculation, religious prestige, and political pressure before he was old enough to understand any of those words. Thomas was born around 1225 into the Aquino family, a noble house with lands and connections in the Kingdom of Sicily. His father, Landulf, belonged to the minor aristocracy, and his mother, Theodora, came from a family of similar standing. Their world was not royal in the highest sense, but it was close enough to power to feel its demands and its opportunities. A family like theirs did not think of a son only as a son. Each child belonged to a larger pattern of inheritance, alliance, office, and reputation, and the future of the household could be strengthened by a well-placed marriage, a loyal military service, or a religious career that carried authority inside the church. Southern Italy in Thomas's childhood was shaped by the presence of Frederick II, one of the most remarkable and unsettling rulers of the medieval world. Frederick was King of Sicily, Holy Roman Emperor, and a man whose court had a reputation for learning, law, administration, and conflict. He ruled a kingdom where Latin Christians, Greek Christians, Jews, and Muslims had all left their marks on culture and government. To later readers, this mixture can sound almost modern in its variety, but it existed inside a hard medieval structure of hierarchy and rule. Frederick's power also brought him repeatedly into conflict with the papacy, and noble families in his territories had to survive in the shadow of that struggle. The Aquino family lived close enough to these conflicts for politics to become part of ordinary prudence. Land, loyalty, and office were not abstract matters. A lord might need imperial favor in one moment and papal tolerance in another. Monasteries and bishoprics were not merely spiritual places because they also held lands, collected revenues, educated sons, protected influence, and helped noble families place their members inside enduring institutions. For a younger son such as Thomas, religion could be both vocation and family strategy. The two were not always separated in the medieval mind, as sharply as modern people might expect. A younger son in a noble household often faced a different future from an eldest son. The eldest might inherit the main lands, continue the family line, and carry the burden of political position. Other sons had to be placed elsewhere, and the church offered some of the most respected paths available. A monastery could receive a child from a noble family and educate him in Latin, discipline, memory, song, and sacred learning. If that child rose high enough, the family gained not only honor but influence. In Thomas's case, later tradition strongly connects his early path with Monte Cassino, the famous Benedictine monastery that stood as one of the great religious houses of Western Europe. Monte Cassino mattered because it was not just any monastery. It was associated with Saint Benedict himself, the father of Western monasticism, whose rule had shaped centuries of religious life. To have a son connected with such a place could be a mark of great distinction. The abbey possessed ancient prestige, material wealth, and symbolic authority, and a noble family might imagine that a gifted child placed there could one day rise within its hierarchy. Thomas's family, so later accounts suggest, may have hoped that he would eventually become abbot, a position that would have joined holiness, status, and family advantage in a single office. No one should imagine that this made Thomas's childhood cold or loveless. Medieval family ambition did not necessarily exclude affection. Parents could care deeply for a child and still think of that child's life through the duties of blood, class, and household survival. In the world of Roccasecca, the private and public meanings of a life were woven together. A son could be beloved, disciplined, offered, corrected, and planned for by the same family. The modern idea of a child growing freely toward a personal dream would have seemed thin beside the thick web of obligations that surrounded noble birth. The castle world into which Thomas was born would have taught hierarchy before argument. Servants, retainers, relatives, clerics, messengers, and armed men all belonged to the visible order of the household. Clothing marked rank. Speech followed deference. Food, rooms, animals, weapons, books, and chapel space all reminded a child that life was arranged by station. Even before formal schooling, a noble child absorbed the shape of command and obedience. Thomas would later become famous for ordering vast fields of thought, but his earliest world had already taught him that order was not an ornament. It was the condition under which a household, a monastery, a kingdom, and a soul were expected to live. Still, there is a danger in reading too much destiny into childhood. Thomas did not become Thomas Aquinas because the stones of Roccasecca somehow foretold the Summa Theologiae. Many children were born into noble households. Many were sent to monasteries. Many learned Latin, prayer, and discipline without becoming one of the central theologians of Christian history. What matters is not that his childhood explains everything, but that it gave him the first materials out of which his life would later be formed. He came from a world where authority was real, where the church was not a distant idea, where learning belonged to institutions, and where family expectation could press upon the soul with the force of law. His early placement at Monte Cassino appears to have begun when he was still very young. A child sent to such a monastery entered a life built around repetition. The Psalms were sung and memorized. Latin words became familiar through prayer before they became tools of argument. The day was divided by offices, meals, lessons, silence, and obedience. A monastery did not educate through novelty. It educated through rhythm, through the steady return of the same sacred words until the mind began to carry them inwardly. For a boy of noble birth, this was both a spiritual formation and a social preparation for ecclesiastical life. Monte Cassino also placed Thomas inside a much older story than the story of his own family. Benedict had founded his monastic life there in the 6th century, and the abbey had endured destruction, rebuilding, patronage, and political entanglement across many generations. Its memory stretched backward into the early medieval centuries, when monasteries preserved books, organized labor, received gifts, and prayed for the living and the dead. A child formed there encountered a version of time unlike the quick time of household ambition. Monastic life taught the weight of continuity. A prayer said in one century could be answered by the same words in another. Yet the 13th century was not content to leave Thomas inside an older Benedictine horizon. The world outside the monastery was changing. Towns were growing. Universities were becoming powerful centers of study. New religious orders, especially the Franciscans and Dominicans, were moving through cities rather than remaining fixed in ancient abbeys. Aristotle's works, long known only in part in the Latin West, were arriving with new force through translations and commentaries. Christian thinkers were beginning to face a vast body of philosophy that seemed too useful to ignore and too dangerous to accept without judgment. The boy at Monte Cassino belonged to a world that still honored the monastery, but the future of learning was beginning to gather elsewhere. The political struggles of Frederick II helped move Thomas along that path. The emperor's conflicts with the papacy affected monasteries and noble houses throughout the region, and Monte Cassino itself could not remain untouched by the pressure surrounding it. Thomas eventually left the monastery and continued his education at Naples, a city whose intellectual atmosphere differed sharply from Benedictine stability. That move would become decisive, though it may not have seemed so at first. Families often sent sons from one respected institution to another, and a young nobleman's studies could still be imagined as part of an acceptable religious career. Naples, however, offered Thomas something different. It was a royal city shaped by Frederick's policies, and its university had been founded in 1224 to serve the needs of the kingdom. Unlike the older schools of Paris or Bologna, it was tied closely to royal purpose. There, Thomas encountered a more urban and argumentative kind of learning. He also encountered the Dominican friars, whose poverty and preaching mission stood far from the path his family had probably intended. The contrast was quiet at first, but it would soon become the first great conflict of his life. For the moment, he was still the son of Roccasecca, the child of Landulf and Theodora, the noble boy whose family could imagine his future in honorable and familiar forms. His earliest world had given him rank, expectation, Latin formation, and the memory of a great monastery. It had also placed him in a region where empire and papacy, old monastic prestige and new urban learning, noble ambition and religious vocation all met uneasily. Thomas would not reject that world all at once. He would carry much of it with him. But in Naples, among books, masters, students and friars, another path began to open, one his family had not chosen and would not easily accept. Chapter 2. Monte Cassino and the Benedictine Horizon. Monte Cassino was already ancient when Thomas Aquinas entered its world. The monastery stood on a high mountain between Rome and Naples, carrying the memory of Saint Benedict and the long discipline of Western monastic life. For centuries, the abbey had been more than a house of prayer. It had been a guardian of books, a receiver of noble children, a landholder, a political presence, and a symbol of religious continuity in a region where armies, rulers, and dynasties had passed with less permanence than the monks' daily offices. A child sent there did not step into a school in the modern sense. He entered a formed way of life. The Benedictine day was shaped by prayer, reading, work, silence, correction, and repetition, with the hours arranged around the worship of God rather than the ambitions of the individual student. Latin was not merely a subject. It was the language of psalms, lessons, rules, charters, prayers, and authority. Before a boy learned to argue in Latin, he learned to hear it as the sound of order. Thomas's family had reason to see Monte Cassino as a fitting place for him. A noble son placed in such an abbey could be educated under the protection of one of Christendom's most prestigious religious houses. If he rose there, the family might gain honor without appearing worldly, influence without abandoning piety, and security through an institution older than many kingdoms. In the medieval world, this was not a contradiction. Religion and family advancement often moved through the same door, especially when the door belonged to a monastery with lands, privileges, and a name known far beyond its mountain. The abbey's prestige came from its connection to Benedict of Nursia, whose rule had shaped Western monasticism since the early Middle Ages. Benedict's rule was not a dramatic document. Its power lay in proportion, balance, and endurance. It arranged a life in which prayer, labor, obedience, humility, and communal order could continue day after day without depending on heroic emotion. For a child like Thomas, this meant that religious life first appeared not as argument or preaching, but as a rhythm repeated until it became almost the structure of time itself. Inside such a place, education was inseparable from formation. A boy learned letters, but he also learned posture, restraint, rank, and attention. He learned when to speak and when not to speak. He learned that books were precious objects, not casual possessions. Manuscripts had to be copied, preserved, handled, and read aloud within a culture that gave written words unusual weight. A page was not just a surface carrying information. It was the result of animal skin prepared as parchment, ink made and stored, a trained hand at work, and many hours of labor gathered into a single usable object. Monte Cassino had known violence and rebuilding across its long history, but its identity rested on continuity. The monks prayed in a place associated with a saint who had lived many centuries before them, and their daily words joined them to generations they had never met. This mattered for Thomas because his first serious religious formation came from an institution that understood truth as something received, guarded, repeated, and handed on. Later, when he entered the restless debates of Paris and Naples, he would move with a mind trained not only by sharp questions, but by the older patience of monastic order. A noble household such as the Aquinas could admire that patience without intending poverty for their son. Benedictine life at Monte Cassino carried dignity. It had an established place in the social imagination of the aristocracy. An abbot could be a figure of real importance, and a great monastery could stand close to rulers, bishops, and landholding families. If Thomas's relatives imagined him rising there, they were not imagining a withdrawal into insignificance. They were imagining a form of religious power that made sense to them. That expectation helps explain the shock that came later. The Dominicans, whom Thomas would eventually choose, represented a newer and less settled religious path. They moved through towns. They preached. They studied in universities. They lived by mendicant poverty, which meant dependence rather than possession. Compared with the ancient strength of Monte Cassino, the Dominican life could appear unstable, exposed, and socially diminished. At Monte Cassino, the young Thomas encountered the Benedictine horizon before he encountered the Dominican road. The abbey taught that holiness could be ordered through a stable community under a rule. It also taught that learning belonged inside obedience. A monk did not study in order to become interesting. He studied in order to read scripture, chant the office, understand doctrine, and serve the life of the house. This was a very different world from the competitive disputations of the universities, but it gave Thomas a first model of disciplined intelligence. The political world outside the monastery did not remain distant. Frederick II's struggles with the papacy pressed upon southern Italy in repeated ways, and Monte Cassino stood in territory where imperial and papal interests could not be ignored. The abbey's wealth and location made it visible. Its prestige protected it, but also made it useful to competing powers. A monastery might be dedicated to prayer, yet its lands, walls, revenues, and loyalties placed it within the practical world of medieval politics. For a boy inside the abbey's care, these tensions would not have appeared as a neat lesson in constitutional conflict. They would have appeared through changes in authority, uncertainty among adults, the movement of officials, and the knowledge that great powers could disturb even sacred places. Medieval religious institutions were not floating above history. They had charters, dependencies, protectors, enemies, and obligations. The spiritual life was real, but it was lived on land that could be taxed, threatened, occupied, or claimed. Thomas's departure from Monte Cassino was connected to this unsettled world. The conflicts surrounding Frederick II and the papacy made the abbey a less secure place for the path his family had imagined. He was sent on to Naples, where his education could continue in a setting more directly tied to the emperor's kingdom. On the surface, this may have seemed like a practical adjustment. A promising young nobleman would keep studying. His future within the church could still be preserved. Nothing in the move had to announce a rupture. Yet Naples was not Monte Cassino, and the difference mattered. A monastery educated through stability, memory, and rule. A university city educated through lecture, argument, commentary, and encounter. Naples had been founded as a royal university by Frederick II in 1224, only a little before Thomas's birth, and it served a different purpose from the older monastic schools. It was designed to train useful minds for the kingdom, to keep students within Frederick's sphere, and to offer learning under royal authority rather than sending everyone northward to older centers. The move from Monte Cassino to Naples therefore carried Thomas from one model of learning into another. In the monastery, books were received within a sacred rhythm. In the city, books became instruments of inquiry, dispute, and intellectual movement. Aristotle's writings, newly available in fuller form to Latin scholars, would have greater room to unsettle and attract. The Dominicans, too, could be encountered more directly in an urban setting, where preaching orders had found their natural ground among students, townspeople, and schools. Monte Cassino did not disappear from Thomas's life when he left it. Its mark remained in the seriousness with which he treated order, discipline, and received authority. Even his later works, written in the language of disputation, carry something of a monastic desire for arrangement. Questions are placed in sequence. Objections are allowed to speak. Authorities are cited. Replies are given. The mind does not wander loosely. It moves through an order, and that order has moral weight as well as intellectual form. Still, Thomas's future required more than the Benedictine horizon could give him. The 13th century was drawing certain minds toward the cities, where friars argued, students gathered, translations circulated, and old teachings met new difficulties. The stability of Monte Cassino formed him, but Naples would disturb him in fruitful ways. A child prepared for an honorable place in an ancient monastery would soon encounter a poorer order, a sharper intellectual world, and a philosopher whose works seemed to open creation itself to patient examination. The family plan had not yet failed. To those watching from the outside, Thomas could still become what noble expectation wished him to be: learned, religious, respectable, and useful to his house. But the movement away from Monte Cassino had placed him nearer to forces his family could not fully control. The monastery had given him the older language of obedience and sacred learning. Naples would give him Aristotle, the Dominicans, and the first clear shape of a choice that would unsettle everything arranged for him. Chapter 3: Naples and the arrival of Aristotle. Naples gave Thomas Aquinas a different kind of education from the one he had known at Monte Cassino. The monastery had stood on its mountain with the weight of centuries behind it, but Naples belonged to a more restless world of streets, courts, ships, officials, students, and arguments moving through the city with the energy of a kingdom being governed. It was not the old silence of Benedictine walls that shaped the place. It was a royal city, practical and ambitious, where learning served administration as well as contemplation, and where a young man could encounter books and people his family had not fully intended for him. Frederick II had founded the University of Naples in 1224, only a little before Thomas's birth. The emperor wanted a school inside his own kingdom, one that could train lawyers, officials, and educated servants without sending them to Bologna, Paris, or other centers beyond his direct control. That purpose gave Naples a character different from the older and more organic universities of Europe. It was not merely a gathering of masters that had grown slowly into privilege. It was a royal foundation, tied from the beginning to power, law, and the needs of government. For Thomas, this mattered because the city opened a path between inherited religious expectation and the wider intellectual life of the 13th century. He was still a noble son, being educated for a respectable future. Nothing about his arrival in Naples required a break with his family. A young man could study there, improve his Latin, learn the arts, encounter law or philosophy, and still remain within the broad plan imagined for him. Yet the material placed before a student in Naples was not the same as the material formed by monastic routine. The classroom could lead toward questions that did not remain obedient to family design. Among the most important of those questions came through Aristotle. For centuries, Latin Christendom had known parts of Aristotle's logic, but during the 12th and 13th centuries, a much larger body of his work entered Western schools. Texts on physics, metaphysics, the soul, ethics, and natural philosophy became available through translation from Greek and Arabic, often accompanied by commentaries written by Muslim and Jewish thinkers. These works did not arrive as harmless curiosities. They brought a dense and powerful account of nature, causation, knowledge, and human purpose, and Christian teachers had to decide how far such a pagan mind could be trusted. A book could travel slowly and still alter the speed of thought. Aristotle's works moved through translators, libraries, lecture rooms, and commentaries, and each stage changed the way Latin scholars encountered him. A student did not merely pick up Aristotle as a modern reader might open a printed volume. He received the text through a chain of language, explanation, suspicion, and authority. Greek terms had passed into Arabic, Arabic learning into Latin, and Latin masters then tried to make this inherited structure intelligible inside Christian doctrine. Naples exposed Thomas to this new intellectual atmosphere at a decisive age. The old monastic formation had taught him reverence for order and authority, but Aristotle offered another kind of order, an account of the natural world examined through causes, categories, motion, substance, and purpose. This was not theology in the strict sense. It did not begin with scripture or the sacraments. It began with the world as the mind could examine it. For a young student whose later life would be spent arranging reason and revelation together, the encounter was not a passing academic influence. It gave him a language through which created things could be studied without being treated as distractions from God. The danger, to many Christian minds, lay exactly there. Aristotle seemed to make the world intelligible on its own terms. His philosophy could be read as granting nature a coherence that did not constantly require direct appeal to miracle or mystery. Some of his later interpreters appeared to raise even sharper problems, especially around the eternity of the world, the nature of the intellect, and the relation between philosophical truth and revealed doctrine. These were not small matters for medieval theologians. They touched creation, the human soul, divine providence, and the authority of Christian teaching. Thomas did not resolve these questions in Naples, and he should not be imagined as a mature theologian while still a student. What Naples gave him was exposure. It brought him closer to the intellectual materials that would later become central to his work. It also brought him into contact with the Dominican friars, whose order had been founded for preaching, study, and the defense of doctrine in a world full of new religious and intellectual pressures. The meeting of Aristotle and the Dominicans in Thomas's early life was not accidental in its deeper meaning. One gave him a body of thought that needed Christian judgment. The other gave him a way of life devoted to teaching and preaching that judgment. The Dominicans were still a young order when Thomas encountered them. Dominic had died in 1221, and the order's identity was still fresh in the religious landscape of Europe. Unlike monks, who were normally bound to a particular monastery, Dominican friars moved through cities, schools, and preaching circuits. Their poverty was not the settled poverty of a monk within a wealthy abbey. It was mendicant poverty, a dependence that placed them among urban populations and made their lives more exposed. They were formed for speech as well as prayer, for argument as well as contemplation, and for the difficult work of correcting error without abandoning learning. In Naples, Thomas would have seen that this life differed from the Benedictine path his family could understand. The Dominican habit did not carry the same old aristocratic prestige as Monte Cassino. It was plain, public, and poor. Its authority came less from ancient landholding and more from mission, learning, papal approval, and the persuasive force of preaching. To a noble household, this distinction mattered greatly. A son who became a Benedictine abbot might still belong, in some recognizable way, to the structure of family honor. A son who became a mendicant friar stepped into a more unsettling form of religious life. At this point, the inward movement of Thomas's vocation becomes difficult to reconstruct with precision. Medieval sources preserve the outline of his decision more clearly than the private stages by which he reached it. He studied, he encountered the Dominicans, and he chose them. The simplicity of that sequence can conceal the force of the act. For Thomas, joining the Dominicans meant moving toward a life of study and poverty that did not fit the future prepared for him. It meant accepting a religious form that was still controversial in some circles and socially painful to his family. A young nobleman did not make such a choice in isolation. Masters, friars, confessors, fellow students, and household expectations all formed the air around him. Naples was a city where such influences could cross one another. The university placed Thomas among students and teachers. The Dominicans placed before him a model of disciplined religious intellect. Aristotle placed before him the promise that the created world could be investigated with rigor. Frederick's royal foundation had gathered the conditions, though not for the purpose Thomas would make of them. This is one of the notable turns in his life. The emperor founded a university to serve the kingdom, but one of the students formed there would become far more important to theology than to royal administration. A city built partly for the training of officials helped prepare a friar whose work would outlive the kingdom's immediate politics. History often moves through such unplanned consequences, though the people living inside them rarely see their shape. To Thomas's family, the matter would soon appear far less abstract. Their son had not merely learned new books, he had chosen a new life. The choice carried visible signs. A religious habit in the Middle Ages was not just clothing, it announced allegiance, rule, poverty, and obedience. The Dominican habit identified a man as a friar preacher, a member of an order whose place in Christian society was still being argued over by admirers and critics alike. When Thomas accepted that life, he did something more public than holding an opinion. He placed his body, name, and future under a form of discipline his family had not chosen for him. His relatives seem to have understood the implications quickly. The path toward Monte Cassino, with its prestige and possible office, had been replaced by a path toward mendicant poverty and university study. That change threatened more than convenience. It disturbed the family's sense of what Thomas's holiness, learning, and noble birth were supposed to become. Their resistance was therefore not a rejection of religion itself. It was a rejection of a religious choice that seemed to waste a son's rank and remove him from the family's grasp. Naples had done its work quietly. It had not forced Thomas away from his family by a single dramatic event. It had placed him among books, teachers, friars, and questions until another future became visible. Monte Cassino had shown him the dignity of an old religious order. Naples showed him the movement of a new one. Between Aristotle's pages and the Dominican habit, Thomas found a path that joined study, poverty, preaching, and obedience in a form his family could neither welcome nor easily ignore. When Thomas left the safer boundaries of the future imagined for him, the conflict moved from inward choice to outward pressure. His family had invested hope status, and strategy in his religious career, and they were not prepared to watch him disappear into an order of poor preachers without resistance. The young student who had entered Naples as a noble son now stood as a Dominican novice, and the household that had shaped his first world began to close around him again. Chapter 4. The order his family feared. The choice Thomas Aquinas made in Naples did not look to his family like a simple deepening of religious life. It looked like a descent. The Aquino household could understand a son entering the church because the church was one of the great structures through which noble families protected influence, honor, and memory. They could understand a monastery such as Monte Cassino with its ancient prestige and its land-bound authority. A Dominican friar was another matter. The order Thomas chose was poor, mobile, young, and still strange enough to unsettle people who trusted older forms of rank. Dominic of Guzman had founded the Order of Preachers in the early 13th century, and the order received formal papal approval in 1216. Its purpose was not withdrawal from the world in the old monastic pattern. The Dominicans were created for preaching, study, and the defense of Christian teaching in places where error, ignorance, or confusion seemed to threaten the faithful. They belonged to the age of towns and universities as much as to the age of cloisters. Their work required movement. A friar might live in a convent, but his vocation pointed outward, towards streets, pulpits, schools, and disputations. To understand why Thomas's decision mattered, the difference between monk and friar must be kept clear. A Benedictine monk ordinarily belonged to a stable house. He lived under an abbot, followed a rule, prayed the divine office, and remained tied to a monastery whose lands and traditions formed a settled world around him. A Dominican friar lived under a different logic. He was bound to an order with a preaching mission, educated for public teaching, and marked by poverty that made him dependent in a more visible way. The contrast was not absolute, because monks could be learned and friars could live in disciplined communities, but the social meaning of the two lives was very different. For the Aquinos, Monte Cassino could have preserved the dignity of Thomas's birth while giving it a religious form. The abbey's authority was recognizable. Its connection to Saint Benedict, its lands, its long history, and its place among rulers and nobles gave it a weight that a family could respect. A son who rose there might have served God and still strengthened the family's position. In that sense, the imagined Benedictine path was not a rejection of worldly order. It was worldly order transfigured through a respected religious office. Dominican poverty disturbed that arrangement. The white habit and black cloak of the friars did not speak the language of inherited lands. The order was approved by the papacy, respected by many, and increasingly important in the schools, but it lacked the old aristocratic stability that families like the Aquinos could easily trust. A friar's authority came from study, preaching, discipline, and obedience, rather than from holding an ancient abbey. To a noble household that could feel perilously close to losing a son into religious usefulness without family advantage. Thomas's choice also came at a time when the mendicant orders were altering the religious landscape of Europe. The Franciscans and Dominicans had emerged within a church facing growing towns, new forms of lay devotion, heretical movements, and a need for educated preaching. They were not monks in the old sense, and they were not parish clergy in the ordinary sense. Their lives crossed boundaries. They entered cities, taught students, heard confessions, argued doctrine, and moved through communities where older institutions had not always reached with the same force. This made them powerful, but it also made them controversial. Established clergy could resent their privileges. Secular masters in universities could view them as intruders. Families could distrust their poverty. Some admired them as a necessary renewal of apostolic life, while others saw them as disruptive, dependent, and too free from the settled obligations that gave older religious life its recognizable place. Thomas entered the Dominicans while these questions were still alive. He did not join a tame institution whose social meaning had already been settled by centuries. Naples made such a choice possible because the city placed him near both intellectual movement and Dominican life. The order's commitment to study would have mattered to a young man drawn towards serious learning. Dominican houses were not built around ignorance or mere zeal. They needed trained minds, because preaching required doctrine, and doctrine required disciplined education. A friar who preached badly could mislead. A friar who argued weakly could fail in the very work his order had been founded to perform. For Thomas, the Dominican life offered poverty without anti-intellectualism, obedience without the intellectual enclosure of a single monastery, and prayer joined to argument. His family's fear, therefore, arose from more than snobbery, though social rank certainly mattered. They saw that Thomas's choice would remove him from the path they understood. A noble son in a great abbey could remain attached to family expectation even while serving God. A friar preacher belonged to a wider order whose assignments, superiors, schools, and mission did not depend on the family's strategy. The Aquinos could not easily control what he would become. That loss of control lay at the center of the conflict. The medieval household was not a soft boundary around private affection. It was an institution with economic, political, and religious interests. Parents and elder relatives had duties toward the future of the family, and children were often expected to accept those duties as part of the natural order of life. Thomas's brothers and mother did not have to be villains in order to resist him. From their side, they may have believed they were saving him from a disastrous youthful decision, protecting the family from dishonor and returning him to a religious path more suitable to his birth. Thomas, for his part, seems to have understood his choice as obedience to a different authority. The Dominican habit placed him under vows and superiors outside the family structure. This was not the ordinary rebellion of a son looking for independence. It was submission, but submission to a religious form his family did not choose. That is part of what makes the conflict so revealing. Thomas did not reject authority. He transferred himself from one authority into another, and the authority he chose had no convenient place within the household's plans. The decision also showed an early trait that would remain visible in his later intellectual life. Thomas could move with great firmness without theatrical display. The sources do not give us a young man making speeches of defiance in the modern style. They show the outline of a choice made and maintained. His later writing would often work in the same spirit. Objections heard carefully, authorities weighed, distinctions made, conclusions held with calm force. In his youth, before the vast books and university debates, that steadiness appeared first in the matter of his own vocation. A Dominican path would lead him away from southern Italy toward the larger educational networks of the order. The friars understood that serious study required great teachers, and Thomas's gifts would eventually bring him toward figures such as Albert the Great and toward the schools of Paris. For the family, this meant that the son they had hoped to place in a familiar ecclesiastical structure might vanish into an international order of scholars and preachers. His future would be decided not by local advantage, but by Dominican obedience and intellectual promise. The family response came with the force of noble intervention. Thomas was seized by his own relatives while traveling, according to the traditional accounts, and brought back under family control. The details vary in later retellings, but the broad meaning is clear. His relatives did not treat the matter as a private disagreement to be discussed at leisure. They treated it as a crisis requiring physical restraint, persuasion, and time. A household that had failed to prevent the choice would now try to reverse it. Such action can sound startling to modern ears, but within the medieval aristocratic world it belonged to a harsher understanding of family authority. A younger son's religious direction could affect inheritance, alliance, influence, and reputation. Thomas's decision touched all of these. It also touched the family's pride, because a son of Aquino had chosen an order whose poverty made noble status seem irrelevant. To accept that choice would have required the family to accept that Thomas's vocation stood beyond their right to arrange. What followed would become one of the famous early trials of his life. Removed from the free movement of the Dominican order, he was held by those who wanted him to reconsider. His family's purpose was not to make him irreligious, but to make him differently religious, to draw him back toward a form of holiness that could be reconciled with rank. The pressure placed on him was therefore intimate and institutional at once. It came from people who knew his name, his childhood, his family place, and the future they believed he owed them. The order his family feared had already claimed him inwardly, and that made the conflict difficult to resolve by ordinary force. A habit could be taken away. A journey could be interrupted. Letters could be blocked. Arguments repeated. Relatives sent in with appeals to duty and affection. None of that necessarily reached the level where Thomas had made his decision. The Dominican life, once chosen, had become the shape through which he believed his service to God should pass. Naples had introduced the choice, but the family's resistance would test it. The young man who had encountered Aristotle and the friars in a royal city now returned, unwillingly, to the power of blood and household. The old world had not released him. Before Thomas could study under the greatest Dominican masters, before Paris could hear his arguments, before his name could become attached to the intellectual life of the church, he had to remain a friar while those closest to him tried to make him stop being one. Chapter 5: Captivity, Refusal, and the Dominican Habit. Thomas Aquinas had made his choice, but his family had not accepted it. To the Dominicans, his entrance into the order marked the beginning of a religious life shaped by preaching, study, poverty, and obedience. To the Aquino household, it marked the loss of a son into a form of life they considered unsuitable for his birth. The conflict that followed was not a disagreement between belief and unbelief. It was a struggle between two claims of obedience, one rooted in blood and household order, the other in a vocation that Thomas believed had already taken hold of him. The traditional accounts place the crisis after Thomas had entered the Dominican order and begun moving under its direction. His superiors intended to send him away from the immediate reach of his family toward the wider schools of the order. That movement made sense. A gifted young friar needed formation, and the Dominicans had begun to build networks of study that stretched beyond one city or one province. For the family, however, each mile threatened to make recovery harder. A son who could still be confronted near home might be persuaded, delayed, or restrained. A son carried into the order's international life might be lost to them for good. His brothers intervened. The accounts differ in detail, as medieval accounts often do, but the central outline is steady enough. Thomas was seized by his own family and held under their control. The action has sometimes been retold with the sharpness of legend, but at its center lay a practical aristocratic decision. The family would not wait for persuasion to work at a distance. They brought him back into the world where they still held power, where walls, kinship, servants, and household authority could all press upon him at once. Captivity is a strong word, yet it fits the shape of what happened. Thomas was not a prisoner of an enemy army or a criminal authority. He was held by his own relatives, which made the pressure more intimate. The people restricting him were the people whose names and expectations had surrounded him since childhood. They did not need to invent a claim over him, because medieval family life had already given them one. For Thomas, that claim could not be dismissed lightly. He was not a modern individual claiming a private right against all inherited obligation. He belonged to a world that took obedience seriously, and he would spend his life writing about law, authority, hierarchy, and the proper ordering of human action. His refusal, therefore, cannot be understood as mere self-assertion. He resisted his family because he believed a higher form of obedience had claimed him. The same man who would later think with great care about order now had to decide which order had the stronger right over his life. The family's purpose was not to tear him away from Christianity. That point matters. They wanted him to abandon the Dominicans, not the church. A return to a Benedictine path, especially one connected to Monte Cassino, could still have satisfied the religious expectations of his class. From their perspective, Thomas had not become too holy. He had chosen the wrong form of holiness, the form that stripped away the advantages they had expected his religious career to preserve. He was held for a considerable period, traditionally at family castles associated with the Aquino household. During that time, relatives tried to bring him back to the path they considered proper. His mother, Theodora, appears in the tradition as a figure of pressure and concern, not merely cruelty. His brothers appear with harsher force. The household seems to have hoped that time itself would weaken his resolve. Isolation could do what argument had failed to do. Removed from Dominican companions, separated from the order's rhythm and enclosed within family authority, Thomas might begin to reconsider. Instead, the period of confinement became part of the story of his steadiness. Later accounts describe him using the time for study, prayer, and reflection. The image is easy to romanticize, but the underlying point is simple and plausible. Thomas did not treat delay as defeat. A man who could not yet travel with the order could still belong to it inwardly. A young friar deprived of movement could still preserve the discipline for which movement had been interrupted. The visible path had been blocked, but the chosen life remained present. One of the most famous traditions from this period tells of an attempt to break his chastity by sending a woman into his room. The story belongs to the hagiographical memory of Aquinas and should be handled with care, because later saints' lives often shaped events into moral episodes with clear symbolic force. Its meaning, however, is plain within that tradition. Thomas's family, or at least some of his brothers, were imagined as trying not only to persuade him, but to make him unfit, ashamed, or inwardly divided. The tale ends with Thomas resisting and preserving the purity associated with his vocation. The physical details need not be lingered over. What matters is how the story was remembered. Medieval readers saw in it a test of chastity, vocation, and resolve. It gave visible shape to the idea that Thomas's commitment had passed beyond ordinary persuasion. Whether every detail belongs to strict history or to the moral pattern of hagiography, the tradition preserved something central about how his early Dominican life was understood. He had been tested by the very household that had formed him, and he had not returned to the future prepared for him. His sisters also appear in some accounts, and their role is gentler. They are said to have visited him during confinement and eventually to have been moved by his explanations. Here the family drama becomes more complex. Not everyone around Thomas can be reduced to opposition. A household was made of many relationships, and influence could move in more than one direction. The captive son could also become the teacher. Even before Paris, even before Cologne, Thomas's capacity to persuade may have begun inside the difficult intimacy of family rooms. The Dominican habit remained at the center of the dispute. Clothing in the medieval world carried meanings that modern dress rarely bears with the same force. To wear a habit was to be seen under a rule. It identified a person's order, vows, obedience, and public place within the church. Thomas's family could restrain his body, but the meaning of the habit was harder to erase once he had accepted it. A quieter form of conflict continued day after day. There were no university disputations in those rooms, no formal objections and replies, no master presiding over an argument. Yet the structure of the problem had the shape of a question Thomas would later have recognized: what is owed to parents, what is owed to God, and what happens when genuine duties do not point in the same direction? Medieval thought did not treat such matters as casual emotion. Duties had order. Love had order. Obedience had order. The painful question was which obedience governed the rest. Thomas's refusal, gradually made the family's position harder to sustain. Force could delay his Dominican life, but it could not create consent. A religious vocation, especially one attached to vows and ecclesiastical approval, could not be undone merely by keeping a son behind walls. The longer he remained firm, the more the family faced the limits of its own authority. They could hold him, but they could not make him inwardly return. Eventually, the pressure failed. The tradition says that his family allowed him to escape or arranged a release that preserved some appearance of dignity. In either case, Thomas returned to the Dominicans. This return was more than a logistical matter. He had entered the order once by choice, but now he entered it with that choice tested by family opposition. The path that had seemed unacceptable to his relatives had survived the strongest pressure they could place upon it. The episode left a mark on the way his life would later be remembered. It gave his vocation the character of trial. A noble young man had not drifted casually into the Dominicans because the order was nearby or intellectually attractive. He had remained with them when remaining carried cost. In the memory of the order, this mattered greatly. The Dominicans gained not only a brilliant recruit, but a story of firmness that suited the order's own self-understanding. Poverty chosen over status, preaching over inherited honor, obedience to vocation over the claims of blood. For Thomas himself, the aftermath led back into study. Once free from family restraint, he could be sent northward, away from the immediate reach of the Aquino household and toward the teachers who would shape his mind more fully. His family had tried to return him to a familiar religious future. Instead, their resistance clarified the distance between that future and the one he had chosen. The boy of Roccasecca, the student of Monte Cassino, and the young man of Naples now belonged openly to the order of preachers. That belonging would soon bring him into contact with Albert the Great. Under Albert, the scattered elements of Thomas's formation would begin to gather: the discipline of monastic learning, the questions raised by Aristotle, the Dominican commitment to preaching, and the steadiness hardened during confinement. Family pressure had not broken his vocation. It had carried him to the edge of the intellectual world where his vocation would find its master. Chapter 6. Albert the Great and the School at Cologne. Albert the Great entered Thomas Aquinas' life as more than a teacher. He belonged to the rare kind of medieval scholar whose mind seemed able to move across nearly every field available to learned Europe. Theology, logic, natural philosophy, ethics, plants, animals, minerals, the structure of the heavens, the writings of Aristotle, and the duties of Christian doctrine all found a place in his work. Later generations would call him Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great. But when Thomas came under his guidance, Albert was not yet a monument. He was a living master inside a young religious order trying to train minds strong enough for the new intellectual world. Cologne was one of the places where that training took shape. The Dominican order had understood early that preaching required study, and study required serious schools. A friar who was sent to preach without doctrine could do harm. A friar who could repeat doctrine without understanding it could be defeated by better trained opponents. The order therefore built houses of study where young men learned not only to speak but to think with discipline. Cologne gave Thomas a setting away from his family's reach, under the authority of a master whose intellectual range matched the questions now entering the schools. The move northward also changed the scale of Thomas's world. Roccasecca had given him family and rank. Monte Cassino had given him monastic order. Naples had given him Aristotle and the Dominicans. Cologne now placed him inside the wider European network of learning, where a friar from southern Italy could sit among students drawn by the reputation of a German master. Medieval Christendom was often local in its loyalties, but learning had roads of its own. A gifted student could move from kingdom to kingdom because Latin, religious obedience, and the university culture allowed minds to travel farther than most lives. Albert was especially important because he did not treat Aristotle as a danger to be dismissed too quickly. He studied the philosopher with unusual patience, commenting on his works and trying to understand the natural order through the tools Aristotle offered. This did not make Albert less Christian. It made him one of the scholars who believed Christian thought had to face the strongest available account of nature rather than hide from it. For Thomas, such a teacher mattered greatly. The student who had encountered Aristotle in Naples now found a master who could show how that encounter might be disciplined. Cologne's school would not have resembled a modern classroom with printed books, private desks, and silent reading as the normal mode of study. Teaching was oral, textual, and communal. A master lectured on an authoritative work, explained difficult passages, raised questions, answered objections, and trained students to follow the movement of an argument. Texts were scarce enough to require care. Parchment, ink, memory, and dictation all belonged to the working life of study. A student learned by listening, copying, repeating, and asking, and the mind was expected to hold more than a modern reader often needs to hold because the page was not always close at hand. Thomas's own manner seems to have drawn attention. Later tradition remembers him as large in body, quiet in speech, and slow to display himself. Some fellow students are said to have called him the dumb ox, not because they thought him incapable of speech, but because his silence and physical presence made him easy to underestimate. The nickname has the rounded simplicity of a school memory, the sort of phrase that survives because it turns a human habit into a story. Whether every detail is exact or softened by later telling, it reflects something that mattered in his reputation. Thomas did not announce his intelligence by noise. Albert's response to him became one of the famous miniature moments in Aquinas' early life. The master is said to have recognized the depth hidden beneath the student's silence and to have predicted that the sound of this ox would one day be heard throughout the world. The line is shaped by memory and may have been polished by tradition, but its meaning endured because it captured a true reversal. The student whom others treated as slow would become the teacher whose writings filled schools. The quietness that seemed like dullness concealed an extraordinary capacity for order. That capacity did not appear from nowhere. Thomas had been formed by several kinds of discipline before he reached Albert. Noble life had taught him hierarchy. Benedictine education had taught him repetition and reverence for authority. Naples had exposed him to new books and a new vocation. Family confinement had tested his steadiness. Under Albert, these earlier formations could be turned toward intellectual labor. His mind did not have to choose between obedience and inquiry as if they were enemies. In the Dominican school, inquiry itself could become a form of obedience. Albert's teaching on natural philosophy helped prepare Thomas for the central task of his mature work. Christian theology already possessed scripture, the fathers, councils, liturgy, and centuries of reflection. Aristotle offered something different, a disciplined way of speaking about change, cause, substance, form, matter, purpose, and the intelligibility of the world. Those categories could not simply be dropped into Christian doctrine without adjustment. They had to be tested, limited, corrected, and sometimes transformed. Albert gave Thomas an example of how to engage that labor without fear and without surrender. A lesser student might have imitated Albert only in surface habits. Thomas absorbed something deeper. He learned how a Christian thinker could take pagan philosophy seriously while refusing to let it become the final judge of revelation. This balance required patience because the easy solutions were always nearby. One could reject Aristotle as dangerous and lose much of his explanatory power. One could accept Aristotle too quickly and risk bending doctrine around him. Thomas's later greatness would lie partly in his refusal to choose either lazy answer. The Dominican setting sharpened this task. The order of preachers did not study in order to produce private speculation alone. Its intellectual work served preaching, teaching, correction, and the care of souls. A friar's learning had to become communicable. It had to enter sermons, disputations, classrooms, and confessional instruction. Albert's school, therefore, trained Thomas not only to understand difficult things, but to arrange them so that others could be led through them. This would become one of Aquinas' most distinctive gifts. He did not merely possess arguments, he built pathways through them. Cologne also placed Thomas inside a culture of disputation before his Parisian maturity. Medieval students were trained to hear objections as part of truth's discipline. A difficulty was not automatically an enemy. It was something to be stated as strongly as possible, then answered in the right order. This habit would become visible in the structure of Aquinas' later works, where opposing views are not hidden, but placed at the beginning of the article. The method can feel strange to modern readers, who may expect an author to begin by declaring his own position. Thomas often begins by allowing the other side to speak. That habit reveals a great deal about his intellectual temperament. He trusted order enough to let disorder appear first. He could begin with objections because he believed they could be answered. He could cite authorities with respect while still making distinctions among them. He could use reason without making reason lonely. In Cologne, under Albert, these traits were still being formed, but the shape of the later master can already be sensed. The young friar was learning that thought did not become weaker when it moved slowly through difficulty. It became more durable. The relationship between Albert and Thomas also belonged to the larger story of the Dominicans. The order needed brilliant teachers because its mission depended on doctrine made public. Albert had already become one of its major intellectual figures, and Thomas would eventually carry that work into an even more systematic form. Their connection shows how religious orders transmit more than rules. They transmit habits of mind, methods of reading, loyalties to certain questions, and confidence in certain forms of labor. A student receives not only information from a master, but a way of inhabiting the work. There is a quiet tenderness in the tradition of Albert recognizing Thomas. Medieval schools could be severe places, and intellectual life did not remove rivalry, impatience, or mockery. Yet the story preserves the image of a teacher seeing what others missed. Thomas's silence did not protect him from misunderstanding. Albert's attention gave that silence a different meaning. A mind that might have remained hidden among louder students was brought forward by a master who knew the difference between emptiness and reserve. From Cologne, Thomas's path led toward Paris, where his gifts would be tested in the most important theological school of Latin Christendom.
Albert had given him formation, but Paris would give him a larger arena.
There, the Dominican friar would have to move from student promise into public authority, from listening under a master to teaching under scrutiny. The habits shaped in Cologne would follow him: patience with objections, confidence in ordered reasoning, reverence for Christian doctrine, and a willingness to face Aristotle without panic. The family at Roccasecca had tried to keep Thomas within a religious future they could recognize. Cologne confirmed how far beyond that future he had gone. He was no longer only a noble son who had refused his family's plans, and no longer only a novice whose vocation had survived confinement. Under Albert the Great, he became part of a disciplined intellectual lineage. The quiet student was being prepared for the schools of Paris, where silence would give way to argument, and argument would begin to make his name known across Christendom. Chapter 7: Paris and the Making of a Master. Paris received Thomas Aquinas as a Dominican student, but the city itself had already become one of the great intellectual powers of Latin Christendom. Its schools had gathered around the Cathedral of Notre Dame and the left bank of the Seine, drawing students and masters from far beyond France. The streets were crowded, the houses close, and the academic life intense enough to give theology a public force it had not possessed in quite the same way before. A young friar arriving there did not enter a quiet retreat of learning. He entered a living corporation of teachers, students, books, privileges, rivalries, and arguments. The University of Paris was not a university in the modern sense of a planned campus with fixed buildings and a single administrative center. It was a community of masters and students, recognized through privileges, organized through faculties, and held together by teaching, examination, and shared legal identity. Its members lived across the city, rented rooms, gathered in schools, and moved between churches, convents, and lecture spaces. A student's world could be poor and crowded, but it also gave him access to an intellectual authority greater than any one classroom. Paris had become a place where theology could be heard as one of the ruling languages of Europe. For the Dominicans, Paris mattered immensely. Their convent of Saint-Jacques stood near the university world and became one of the order's most important houses of study. The friars understood that preaching in a changing Christendom required men trained in the strongest schools available. They did not want learning as ornament. They needed learning as equipment for public doctrine. A Dominican who mastered theology at Paris could teach, preach, dispute, and guide the order's work across a wide field of religious life. Thomas entered this world after his formation under Albert the Great, carrying with him both silence and preparation. The old nickname of the quiet student followed him in memory. But Paris was not a place where hidden ability could remain hidden for long. The university required public performance of the mind. A man had to lecture, answer, distinguish, cite authorities, withstand objections, and show that he could hold difficult questions without disorder. The habits formed under Albert were now placed under the pressure of a greater audience. The formal path toward mastery was slow and structured. Students moved through the arts and then, for those who advanced into theology, through years of hearing lectures, studying scripture, commenting on authoritative texts, and participating in disputations. Theology stood at the summit of the university's faculties, and its masters carried enormous prestige. Their task was not merely to repeat inherited doctrine. They had to clarify it, defend it, and teach it in forms that could withstand the sharpness of trained opposition. Peter Lombard's sentences stood at the center of this formation. Written in the 12th century, it had become the standard textbook for theological study in the schools. Its 4 books gathered questions on God, creation, Christ, virtues, sacraments, and the last things, drawing together authorities from Scripture and the Fathers. The young theologian proved himself by lecturing on the sentences, not because the work exhausted theology, but because it gave students and masters a common field of questions. To comment on Lombard was to enter a conversation already generations old. Thomas's own work on the sentences belonged to this academic path. He did not yet stand at the full height of his later authority, but his mind was already visible in the way he arranged questions and drew distinctions. Medieval commentary was not a passive act. A commentator did not merely restate the master text. He explained, ordered, questioned, supplemented, and sometimes quietly redirected the material. Within the limits of reverence, originality could appear through structure, emphasis, and precision. The Parisian lecture was an event of voice before it became a page for later readers. A master or bachelor read from an authoritative text and explained it, while students listened and took what notes they could. Books were not abundant enough for every student to possess the text in the way modern education assumes. Memory mattered. Attention mattered. The trained ear had to follow the unfolding of an argument, and the trained mind had to retain enough of it to carry the lesson beyond the room. Disputation gave the schools another rhythm. A question was posed. Objections were raised. Authorities were cited. Arguments were weighed. The answer had to emerge without ignoring the difficulties that had been presented. This method suited Thomas because it allowed him to be patient without being vague. He could grant force to an objection, place it within a wider order, and then answer it by making a distinction that changed the shape of the issue. His later works would preserve this schoolroom discipline so thoroughly that the reader can still feel the university behind the page. Paris also exposed him to the tensions surrounding the mendicant orders. Dominicans and Franciscans had become powerful presences in university life, but not everyone welcomed them. Secular masters, who were not members of religious orders, sometimes resented the friars' privileges, their papal support, and their growing influence over theological teaching. The conflict would become sharper later, but even during Thomas's formation, the question was already present. Could men who lived under religious obedience and mendicant poverty hold places of authority in the university's corporate life? Could they teach as masters while belonging to orders whose loyalties extended beyond Paris? For Thomas, such tensions were not distractions from study. They belonged to the world in which study had to be practiced. Theology was never only an abstract arrangement of propositions. It was carried by institutions, protected by privileges, threatened by rivalries, and shaped by the people allowed to teach. A doctrine might be argued in a classroom, but the right to argue from that chair could itself become a matter of dispute. The friar who sought truth also had to live inside the politics of truth's public guardians. His advancement came through the Dominican system and the university's demanding expectations. Thomas became a bachelor of the sentences, lecturing on Lombard and preparing for the higher status of master. The process required endurance as much as brilliance. A mind could be sharp and still fail to become authoritative if it lacked steadiness, memory, discipline, or the ability to teach others. Thomas's gifts lay partly in the calm arrangement of difficulty. He did not merely win points, he made questions inhabitable. That quality began to distinguish him. In a world full of aggressive argument, Thomas's power was often architectural rather than dramatic. He could take a question that had become tangled, separate its strands, identify the different meanings of a word, place an authority in its proper range, and show why an objection struck one part of the issue but not the whole. This was not a small talent. Medieval theology depended on inherited authorities that sometimes seemed to pull in different directions. A master had to preserve reverence without pretending that every difficulty disappeared by being ignored. Paris sharpened his relation to Aristotle as well. The philosopher's works were present in the schools not as neutral material, but as a continuing challenge. The arts faculty had its own engagement with Aristotelian logic and natural philosophy, while theologians had to judge how far such learning could be used in sacred doctrine. Thomas had learned from Albert to take Aristotle seriously. At Paris, that seriousness would meet the wider anxieties of the academic world. The question was no longer whether Aristotle was useful. The question was how he could be used without allowing philosophy to overrun theology. The answer Thomas gradually developed was marked by confidence and restraint. He did not think truth could finally contradict truth, because all truth came from God. Yet he also knew that human reasoning could err, texts could be misunderstood, translations could mislead, and philosophers could reach conclusions that Christian doctrine could not accept. This gave his thought a distinctive posture. He could welcome reason without making it sovereign. He could honor revelation without making created nature unintelligible. Paris gave that balance a public field in which to mature. The making of a master was therefore not only a matter of academic promotion, it was the formation of a public voice. Thomas had to become someone whose answers could be trusted by students, friars, and ecclesiastical authorities. He had to teach in a way that joined humility before tradition, with enough intellectual strength to handle new questions. His Dominican life, his family trial, his study under Albert, and his encounter with Aristotle all converged in Paris. The city did not create his mind, but it gave his mind the arena in which its order could become visible. When Thomas finally stood among the masters, he did so as a member of an order still young, a a scholar shaped by a controversial philosopher, and a theologian trained in a university where every claim had to face objection. The path from Roccasecca to Paris had carried him through family ambition, monastic discipline, urban study, captivity, and Dominican formation. Now the quiet student had become a teacher in the most demanding theological environment of his age. The next step was not merely to hold a title, but to enter the arguments of the schools with a method that would make his name endure. Chapter 8. The Arguments of the Schools. The schools of Paris trained Thomas Aquinas in a way of thinking that may seem strange at first, because it began so often with difficulty rather than certainty. A question was placed before the master and students, and the first movement was not to rush toward the approved answer. Objections were gathered. Authorities were set beside one another. A contrary statement was introduced. Only after the difficulty had been allowed to stand did the master begin to answer, not by sweeping the objections away, but by placing them in order. The method was slow, disciplined, and demanding, and it gave medieval theology one of its most recognizable forms. Scholastic argument did not arise because medieval thinkers enjoyed complication for its own sake. It grew from the conditions of their learning. Christian theology carried scripture, the writings of the church fathers, conciliar decisions, canon law, liturgical practice, philosophical inheritance, and centuries of commentary. These authorities did not always appear to speak in one voice. A sentence from Augustine could seem to lean one way, a passage from Aristotle another, a biblical text another still. The task of the theologian was not to choose carelessly among them. He had to distinguish, reconcile, rank, and explain. Peter Lombard's sentences provided one of the main training grounds for that work. By Thomas's time, it had become the central theological textbook of the schools, not because it replaced scripture, but because it organized many theological problems into a usable academic form. Students who advanced in theology were expected to lecture on it. A commentary on the sentences became a kind of intellectual apprenticeship, a public demonstration that a scholar could handle inherited authorities, difficult doctrines, and disputed questions. Thomas's early work on Lombard belongs to this world of disciplined formation. In a scholastic exercise, the order of the argument mattered almost as much as the conclusion. The objections came first because they had to be heard in their strength. Then came an authority on the other side, often introduced from scripture or a respected teacher. After that, the master gave his own answer, carefully framed, and then replied to each objection. The structure created a habit of mind. It taught students that truth was not protected by refusing to listen to difficulty. Truth was protected by hearing difficulty accurately and answering it without panic. Thomas was unusually suited to this method. His mind did not move by ignoring distinctions. It made distinctions visible. A word might carry several meanings, and he would separate them. A statement might be true in one respect and false in another, and he would mark the difference. An authority might speak about one level of reality, while an objection belonged to another. He rarely needed to make an argument feel dramatic, because the power lay in the arrangement. A question that seemed tangled before him often became passable once he had set its parts in the right relation. The classroom behind this method was a world of voice, memory, and trained attention. A master read or expounded a text, and students listened with an intensity made necessary by the scarcity of books. Some had copies or partial texts, but manuscripts were costly, and the culture of study still depended heavily on hearing. The spoken lecture entered notebooks, memory, repetition, and later revision. Academic life was therefore more physical than the finished page suggests. A student sat through long sessions, followed Latin argument by ear, and learned to recognize the movement of a distinction as it was being made. Disputation brought a different pressure. Unlike an ordinary lecture, it placed the question into a public exercise of argument. Objections could be raised with force. A master's answer had to show command not only of doctrine, but of the logic by which doctrine could be defended. Such events trained intellectual steadiness. A scholar who became flustered, vague, or careless with terms could lose the confidence of his listeners. The better master did not merely silence opponents. He absorbed the strongest version of their difficulty into a clearer answer. Thomas's later writings preserve this schoolroom rhythm so fully that they can sometimes feel, to modern readers, almost impersonal. The page opens with objections. A contrary authority appears. The answer follows. Replies close the circle. Yet the form is not cold once its purpose is understood. It is an act of hospitality toward difficulty. The opposing view is not hidden in a footnote or mocked from a distance. It is given the first word, and then it is answered in its proper place. That discipline shaped Thomas's theological temperament. He did not write as a poet of sudden insight, though his work could be beautiful in its clarity. He did not write as a prophet of private experience, though his life was deeply religious. He wrote as a master of sacred doctrine, responsible for teaching others how to move through hard questions without losing the unity of truth. In the schools, such responsibility had a public form. A master's answer could influence students who would become preachers, confessors, teachers, bishops' advisors, and writers in their own right. The scholastic method also trained humility of a certain kind. It required a thinker to admit that objections existed before answering them. It required him to submit his own reasoning to authorities older than himself. At the same time, it demanded courage, because authorities had to be interpreted rather than merely stacked on the page. A timid scholar could hide behind quotation. A reckless one could twist tradition into novelty. Thomas's strength lay in the middle labor, where reverence and judgment worked together. The habit of beginning with objections had another effect. It preserved the drama of thought without turning scholarship into performance. The reader sees the problem before the solution, the resistance before the answer, the apparent contradiction before the distinction that resolves it. This gives Aquinas' work a steady inner movement. Even when the prose is technical, the form carries the memory of a room in which real questions were asked. The method does not shout, but it keeps moving. Paris made this method sharper because the city gathered so many trained minds into one academic culture. Students came from different regions. Masters had reputations to defend. Religious orders brought their own loyalties. Secular clergy watched the friars with suspicion. Aristotle's works pressed new questions into theology, and the university had to decide which forms of reasoning belonged safely within Christian teaching. In such a place, a vague answer could not endure for long. The schools rewarded precision because imprecision gave opponents room to enter. For Thomas, the arguments of the schools were not separate from spiritual life. They were one form of service. The Dominican order existed to preach truth, and preaching required knowledge capable of surviving examination. A friar who taught badly could mislead souls. A friar who feared hard questions could leave others defenseless before them. Scholastic argument, for all its formal structure, served a pastoral purpose within the order's mission. It made doctrine teachable, portable, and answerable. This helps explain why Thomas's work often carries such patience. He was not writing only for masters who already knew the field. He was writing for students being trained to think correctly about God, creation, virtue, sin, grace, Christ, and the sacraments. His mature works would often take difficult questions and arrange them in a sequence that could guide a learner step by step. The desire to teach shaped the architecture of his mind. His thought was vast, but it was rarely careless about the needs of the one being led. Scholasticism has sometimes been remembered unfairly as a dry game of abstractions, a world where men debated imaginary puzzles while life moved elsewhere. There were certainly sterile arguments in the medieval schools, as there are in every intellectual age. Yet the best scholastic work was not detached from reality. It asked what a thing is, what causes it, what it is for, how it can be known, and how it belongs within the order of creation. These questions could be applied to angels and sacraments, but also to law, virtue, money, kingship, teaching, friendship, and ordinary human action. Thomas learned to make that range manageable. He could move from the nature of God to the habits of the soul, from divine simplicity to human law, from the Eucharist to the morality of buying and selling. The movement was possible because the method gave him tools for placing each question within a larger order. Without such structure, the range would have become overwhelming. With it, the world could be approached as intelligible, not because it was small, but because it came from a source of order. The arguments of the schools also prepared Thomas for the central tension of his age, the place of Aristotle in Christian thought. A philosopher who had not known Christian revelation could not be treated as a church father. Yet his account of nature, causality, motion, and knowledge was too powerful to ignore. The scholastic method allowed Thomas to receive Aristotle carefully. He could ask where Aristotle was useful, where he was limited, and where Christian doctrine required correction or refusal. The schoolroom habit of distinction became the instrument by which a pagan philosopher could be read under Christian eyes. By the time Thomas emerged as a master, he had become more than a man with strong opinions. He had become a disciplined handler of questions. The early silence remembered from Cologne had opened into a form of speech that could carry difficulty without haste. His answers did not depend on volume. They depended on placement, proportion, and the patient refusal to confuse one kind of truth with another. In Paris, the method of the schools became the method through which Thomas would enter the largest intellectual challenge of his life: how to bring Aristotle into the service of Christian theology without letting Christian theology become merely Aristotelian. Chapter 9. Aristotle under Christian eyes. Aristotle did not arrive in Thomas Aquinas' world as a harmless old name from antiquity. He arrived as a force. His works carried a way of thinking about nature, motion, causation, the soul, ethics, knowledge, and the structure of reality that seemed broader and more systematic than anything many Latin scholars had previously possessed from a pagan philosopher. The Christian West had long known parts of Aristotle's logic, but the fuller recovery of his writings changed the scale of the encounter. A thinker who had lived before Christ now stood inside Christian classrooms, asking questions with a precision no serious master could easily dismiss. The arrival was not simple. Aristotle's works came into Latin Europe through many paths, and those paths mattered. Some texts were translated from Greek. Others came through Arabic versions and commentaries, carrying with them the labor of Muslim philosophers such as Avicenna and Averroes, along with other interpreters whose own questions had shaped the transmission. Jewish scholars also belonged to the wider world of philosophical exchange. By the time Aristotle reached the schools of Paris, he had not traveled as a bare ancient author. He had traveled with explanations, disputes, errors of translation, and layers of interpretation attached to his name. For the masters of theology, this created both opportunity and unease. Aristotle offered an account of the natural world that was ordered, powerful, and intellectually disciplined. He did not explain things by quick appeal to myth or loose wonder. He asked what things were, what caused them, how they changed, what ends they served, and how the mind could know them. To a theologian such as Thomas, this was invaluable. If creation truly came from God, then created things could be studied with seriousness. Their order was not a rival to divine wisdom. It was one of the ways divine wisdom could be approached. Yet the danger was equally real. Aristotle had not written as a Christian. His account of the world did not begin from Genesis, the Incarnation, grace, or the sacraments. Certain Aristotelian positions, or positions attributed to Aristotle through later interpreters, seem to press against Christian doctrine. The eternity of the world, the nature of the individual soul, the relation between God and the world, and the possibility of providence all raise difficult questions. A careless embrace of Aristotle could bend theology into philosophy. A careless rejection could deprive Christian thought of an extraordinary instrument. Thomas's response was neither fear nor surrender. He read Aristotle with great seriousness, but he did not read him as a master above the faith. This balance is one of the central achievements of Aquinas's life. He believed reason had its own integrity because the human mind was made to know truth. He also believed reason had limits because created intelligence could not measure God as though God were one object among others. Between these two convictions, Thomas found room for a patient Christian use of Aristotle. The problem of Aristotle was sharpened by the presence of Averroes. Averroes, the great Muslim commentator from Cordoba, had become one of the major interpreters of Aristotle for Latin readers. His commentaries were so influential that he was sometimes called simply the commentator, while Aristotle was called the philosopher. Through Averroes, Latin scholars encountered powerful readings of the Aristotelian corpus, including positions that many Christian theologians found unacceptable. The most troubling concerned the intellect and the relation of individual human beings to understanding. If interpreted in a certain way, these ideas seem to threaten personal immortality and the individual destiny of the soul. Avicenna also mattered, though in a different way. His metaphysical language, especially around essence and existence, helped shape the wider intellectual environment in which Thomas worked. Aquinas did not simply repeat Avicenna, but he learned from the philosophical problems Avicenna had helped clarify. Medieval thought moved through such exchanges with a complexity that can be easy to flatten. Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Greek, and Latin traditions did not blend into one simple stream. They met through translation, argument, adoption, correction, and refusal, often in the same scholar's work. Paris became one of the main places where these questions gathered force. The arts masters, whose work focused more directly on philosophy, often approached Aristotle with a confidence that worried theologians. Some seemed to press Aristotelian claims to conclusions that Christian teaching could not accept. Theological authorities responded at times with caution and restriction. Certain teachings associated with Aristotle or his interpreters were condemned or limited in university settings. These measures did not end the encounter. They showed how serious it had become. Thomas entered this conflict with a remarkable steadiness. He did not think Christian theology became safer by refusing to understand its strongest intellectual challenges. Misunderstood Aristotle was more dangerous than carefully interpreted Aristotle. The theologian's task was not to protect doctrine by ignorance, but to judge philosophy rightly. A pagan philosopher could see real truths about the created world because reason itself was part of creation. But when philosophy spoke beyond its proper reach, theology had the right to correct it. This required distinctions of great care. Thomas separated what Aristotle had actually said from what later interpreters claimed in his name. He distinguished truths accessible to natural reason from mysteries known only by revelation. He allowed philosophy to speak about nature, causation, being, and the soul, while refusing to let it decide questions that depended on divine disclosure. The result was not a timid compromise. It was a structured confidence that truth could be approached from different levels without breaking into contradiction. One of the most important areas of tension concerned creation. Christian doctrine taught that the world was created by God from nothing. Aristotle's philosophy, at least as many medieval readers understood it, seemed to imply an eternal world without a beginning in time. Thomas handled this problem with characteristic precision. He held firmly that the world had a beginning because revelation taught it. Yet he also argued that reason alone could not demonstrate with certainty that the world began in time. This was not a weakening of doctrine. It was a careful statement about what reason could and could not prove without revelation. Such distinctions made some readers uneasy because they seemed to grant philosophy too much room. But Thomas's purpose was to protect both faith and reason from confusion. If a doctrine is known by revelation, it should not be presented as though unaided reason can demonstrate it when reason cannot. To claim too much for reason would make reason look weaker once the argument failed. Aquinas preferred a more exact boundary. Reason could show that all being depends on God as cause. Revelation taught that the created world had a first temporal beginning. Each truth had its proper mode of being known. The soul raised another set of problems. Aristotle's account of the soul as the form of the body gave Thomas a powerful way to speak about human unity. A human being was not a soul trapped inside a body, as if the body were only an outer garment. Body and soul belonged together in one nature. This helped Thomas resist crude dualism. Yet he also had to defend the soul's subsistence and immortality against interpretations that seemed to dissolve individual human destiny into a single shared intellect. Here again, Aristotle had to be read carefully, and Averroes had to be challenged where Thomas believed the interpretation failed. In this labor, Aquinas was not merely borrowing useful ideas. He was reshaping the terms of Christian theology's engagement with the natural world. Aristotle gave him language for form and matter, act and potency, substance and accident, final causality and natural motion. Thomas used these tools across theology, ethics, sacramental doctrine, and metaphysics. Bread and wine, human choice, angelic knowledge, law, virtue, and divine simplicity could all be discussed with a precision strengthened by philosophical vocabulary. The philosopher had entered the theologian's workshop. The risk was that such vocabulary might begin to sound like the master rather than the servant. Thomas worked constantly to prevent that inversion. Sacred doctrine, for him, did not take its principles from philosophy. It received them from revelation. Philosophy could clarify, defend, and unfold certain truths, but it could not replace the higher light by which theology knew its proper subject. This hierarchy allowed him to use Aristotle deeply without becoming merely Aristotelian. The order mattered. Philosophy served theology, but real service required strength, not weakness. Aquinas' commentaries on Aristotle show another side of this engagement. He did not only use Aristotle when convenient inside theological works. He studied the philosophical texts directly, explaining them with care. This kind of commentary required a scholar to enter the argument on its own terms. Before correcting, one had to understand. Before using, one had to read. That patience gave Thomas an advantage over those who feared Aristotle from a distance or embraced him through slogans. He allowed the philosopher to be difficult. The Christian reading of Aristotle also changed the way Thomas spoke about the world. Nature was not a meaningless surface waiting to be escaped. It had causes, purposes, and intelligibility. Human reason could discover real things about it. The study of creatures did not have to compete with the love of God, because creatures came from God and bore traces of order. This did not make nature divine. It made nature worthy of study. In Thomas's hands, the created world became more philosophically legible without becoming spiritually closed. That is why Aristotle mattered so much to the later shape of Aquinas' thought. He helped Thomas speak about God not as one being among others, but as the source of being itself. He helped him speak about change through the language of act and potency. He helped him think about virtue as habit, human action as ordered toward an end, law as rational ordinance, and knowledge as beginning in the senses while rising toward intelligible truth. These were not small additions. They affected the grammar of an entire theological system. Still, Thomas never allowed Aristotle to be the final word. Where Christian doctrine required more, he said more. Where Aristotle lacked revelation, Thomas did not pretend otherwise. Where later Aristotelians seemed to threaten the faith, he answered them. This gave his work a double character: open enough to receive the best philosophy available, firm enough to judge it by a higher rule. His confidence rested on the conviction that truth was not fragile. It could be examined without being lost. The encounter with Aristotle under Christian eyes prepared the way for one of the most famous parts of Thomas's work. If reason could truly know something about the world, and if the world depended on God as its source, then reason could also move in a limited but real way toward God. Not toward the mysteries of the Trinity or the Incarnation by its own power, but toward the existence of a first cause, a necessary being, an ultimate source of order. Out of that confidence would come the arguments later known as the 5 ways, brief in form, often misunderstood, and placed inside a much larger vision of reason serving sacred doctrine. Chapter 10: The 5 Ways and the Shape of Reason. 5 brief arguments made Thomas Aquinas famous to readers who have never opened the rest of his work. They appear near the beginning of the Summa Theologiae in the second question of the first part, where Thomas asks whether God exists. Later centuries would lift them out, debate them, defend them, reject them, simplify them, and sometimes misunderstand them so thoroughly that the original setting almost disappeared. In Aquinas' own work, they were not isolated trophies. They were small doors placed at the entrance of a much larger house of thought. The question itself belonged to a careful order. Thomas had begun the Summa by asking about secret doctrine, what it is, why it is needed, how it differs from other kinds of knowledge, and whether it may use human reasoning. Only after that did he turn to God's existence. This sequence matters. He was not starting as a neutral philosopher in an empty room, trying to invent religion from nothing. He was a theologian working inside Christian doctrine, asking what reason could know about the existence of God and how such knowledge belonged within sacred teaching. The 5 ways are often called proofs, but the word can mislead if it is heard in a modern, mathematical, or laboratory sense. Thomas was not offering an experiment. He was not offering a psychological experience. He was not asking the reader to look at a sunset and feel that God must be real. He was working in the language of metaphysics, where motion, causation, contingency, degrees of being, and order pointed beyond themselves toward a first source. The arguments are short because they assume a world of philosophical training behind them. The first way begins with motion, though motion for Aristotle and Thomas means more than movement from one place to another. It means change, the passage from potentiality into actuality. Wood that can be hot becomes hot. A student who can understand comes to understand. A thing that can be otherwise is brought into a new state by something already actual in the relevant respect. Thomas argues that such a chain of change cannot explain itself if it has no first actual source. At the end of the reasoning stands what he calls the unmoved mover, understood by all to be God. This does not mean that Aquinas imagined God as the first object that once pushed the universe and then stood apart from it. That is a common modern misreading. His concern is not only a first event long ago, but the present dependence of changing things upon actuality. A hand moves a staff, the staff moves a stone, and the motion of the staff depends here and now upon the hand. If everything in the chain receives actuality from another, the chain requires a source that does not receive actuality in the same way. Thomas is thinking about dependence, not merely chronology. The second way turns to efficient causation. In the world, things cause other things. Fire heats, parents generate children, builders make houses, teachers produce understanding in students. Thomas does not treat this as a random list of activities, but as a sign of ordered dependence. A thing cannot be the efficient cause of itself, because it would have to exist before itself in order to bring itself into being. If every cause were only caused by another, With no first cause sustaining the order, there would be no sufficient ground for the causal series. Therefore, he argues, there must be a first efficient cause. Again, the point is easily flattened. Thomas is not merely saying that the universe must have had a first moment. He is asking why there is any causal order at all, why dependent causes have the power to cause. A candle can light another candle, but it does not possess existence from itself. A human father can generate a child, but he did not give himself being. Created causes are real for Thomas. He does not make them illusions. Yet their reality depends on a deeper source, and the second way moves through that dependence toward God. The third way begins with contingency. Around us are things that come into being and pass away. Plants grow and die, animals are born and die, human works appear, remain for a time and disappear. Such things are possible not to be. Thomas reasons that if everything were contingent in this way, then at some point nothing would have existed, and from nothing, nothing comes. Therefore, there must be something necessary, something whose existence is not received as a temporary possession. This necessary being, or the source of necessity in others, is what he identifies with God. This argument rests on a deep distinction between what has existence and what is existence by nature. Ordinary things possess being, but they do not explain it. They can fail to exist. Their existence is received, limited, and dependent. Thomas's later metaphysics would place enormous weight on the difference between essence and existence, between what a thing is and the fact that it is. A horse, a tree, a stone, or a human being has a definable nature, but none of them contains within that nature the necessity of existing. The third way turns that observation into a path toward a necessary source. The fourth way is often the hardest for modern readers, because it depends on a way of thinking about degrees of perfection that no longer comes naturally to many minds. Thomas observes that things are called more or less good, true, noble, or excellent. Such gradations, in his framework, point toward a maximum that is the cause of whatever is found in lesser degrees. He is not making a casual argument from comparison. He is working within a metaphysical view in which participated perfections depend upon a fullest source. What is good by participation depends upon what is good in itself. This way can sound distant from ordinary experience, but it reflects a common medieval confidence that qualities such as truth and goodness are not merely private preferences. They are rooted in being. A thing is good insofar as it has fullness according to its nature. A true judgment conforms to what is. A noble act participates in an order of value not invented by the human will. Thomas moves from degrees of such perfections toward a source in which these perfections are not borrowed or partial, but fully grounded. The fifth way begins with order or governance. Natural things that lack knowledge act toward ends. Seeds develop toward plants of their kind. Bodies behave according to regular patterns. Natural processes display directedness, even when the things involved do not understand what they are doing. Thomas argues that what lacks intelligence does not move toward an end unless directed by intelligence, as an arrow is directed by an archer. Therefore, the order of natural things points toward an intelligent governor. This argument is not identical to later design arguments about complex organs or the mechanical intricacy of the universe. Though later readers often blend them together, Thomas is thinking in terms of final causality, the orientation of things toward ends. For Aristotle and Aquinas, nature is not a heap of objects pushed from behind by blind force alone. Things have tendencies, operations, and fulfillments proper to what they are. The acorn's movement toward the oak is not conscious, but it is ordered. The fifth way asks why such ordering belongs to nature at all. Taken together, the 5 ways do not attempt to describe everything Christians believe about God. They do not prove the Trinity. They do not prove the Incarnation. They do not prove grace, the Church, the sacraments, or the resurrection of the body. Thomas knew this perfectly well. His purpose was more limited and more precise. Reason can know that God exists as first mover, first cause, necessary being, source of perfection, and intelligent governor. Revelation then teaches truths about God that exceed the natural power of the human mind. That distinction was essential to his whole project. Thomas did not want to make reason pretend it could reach mysteries it could not reach. At the same time, he did not want faith to become a refusal of reason. He believed human intelligence could genuinely know some truths about God from creatures. The created world is not mute. It cannot tell the whole mystery, but it can point beyond itself. The 5 ways give that pointing a disciplined form. Aquinas' God, in these arguments, is not one being inside the world competing with other beings. This is another place where misunderstanding enters. He is not speaking of a very powerful object placed at the beginning of a series. He is speaking of the source on which beings depend here and now for existence, causality, order, and intelligibility. The conclusion of the 5 ways is only the beginning. After establishing that God exists, Thomas must ask what God is not, how language can speak of God, how divine simplicity should be understood, and how creatures relate to their Creator. The brevity of the arguments has helped and harmed them. It helped because they could be remembered. It harmed because readers often detach them from the metaphysics that gives them force. Without act and potency, the first way becomes a crude claim about motion. Without a proper sense of causal dependence, the second way becomes a simple first event argument. Without contingency and necessity in the deeper metaphysical sense, the third way sounds like a puzzle about time. Without participation, the fourth way seems strange. Without final causality, the fifth becomes something other than Thomas's own reasoning. In the medieval schools, however, these arguments belonged to a fuller intellectual world. Students had been trained in logic and philosophy. They understood that causes were not only events happening one after another. They knew that the language of being carried layers of meaning. They had heard Aristotle discussed, corrected, and interpreted through Christian teaching. Thomas could write compactly because his readers were expected to bring that formation to the page. The modern reader often needs the missing background restored. There is also a modesty in the placement of the 5 ways that should not be missed. Thomas does not make them the emotional climax of his theology. He gives them, completes them, and moves on. The existence of God, once shown in this limited philosophical way, opens into a much larger inquiry. What can be said of God? Whether God is simple, whether God is perfect, whether God is good, whether God is infinite, whether God knows all things. The proofs are the threshold, not the whole dwelling. This modesty makes them more interesting, not less. Aquinas was not trying to win a debate and stop thinking. He was trying to begin in the right place. If God is the first source of being, then theology must proceed differently from any science that studies one class of created things. If God is not a being among beings, then ordinary language must be purified when it speaks of him. If creatures depend on God, then every discussion of creation, human action, grace, and salvation rests on a deeper metaphysical ground. The 5 ways establish the first lines of that ground. For Thomas, reason's movement toward God was real but limited, honorable but incomplete. It could rise from creatures to Creator, but it could not climb into the inner life of God by its own strength. That boundary did not humiliate reason. It gave reason its proper dignity. A mind is most itself when it knows both what it can do and what it cannot do. In Aquinas' theology, faith does not destroy reason, and reason does not replace faith. Each has a place within the order of truth. A young student who had encountered Aristotle in Naples and learned under Albert in Cologne now gave Christian theology a set of arguments whose influence would travel for centuries. They were brief, but they rested on a lifetime of formation, monastic discipline, Dominican study, Parisian disputation, Aristotelian philosophy, and a confidence that creation could lead the mind toward its source. From these small doorways, Thomas moved into the greater work of arrangement. The Summa would not stop with proving that God exists. It would try to set the whole field of sacred teaching into order. Chapter 11. The Summa begins. A book can become so famous that its original purpose grows difficult to see. The Summa Theologiae now stands in memory as one of the great monuments of medieval thought, vast in scope and severe in organization, a work that seems almost too large to have been written for ordinary teaching. Thomas Aquinas, however, described it as a work for beginners. That phrase can surprise later readers because the book is not simple in the modern sense. Its beginner was not a child or a casual reader, but a student entering sacred doctrine who needed a clearer path through material that had become dense, scattered, and difficult to master. Thomas began the Summa after years of training, teaching, disputing, commenting, and writing smaller works. He had already passed through Monte Cassino, Naples, Cologne, and Paris. He had absorbed the discipline of the schools and the philosophical language of Aristotle. He had seen how students could become tangled in authorities before they had learned the order of the subject itself. The Summa was born from that educational problem. It tried to give sacred doctrine a sequence, so that the learner did not wander through theology as through a crowded room of separate questions. The title itself points toward gathering. A summa was a summation, an ordered treatment, a work that collected and arranged a field of knowledge. Thomas was not gathering theology because he believed earlier centuries had failed. He was gathering it because the inheritance was rich enough to require careful arrangement. Scripture, Augustine, Gregory the Great, Dionysius, John Damascene, canon law, Aristotle, the Lombard, and many other authorities all stood behind the work. The question was how to lead a student through that inheritance without allowing the abundance itself to become confusion. The physical making of such a work belonged to a manuscript culture that demanded patience from every hand involved. Thomas did not sit before a printed library and a stack of cheap paper. Books had to be copied, parchment had to be prepared, secretaries and assistants mattered. Dictation was part of scholarly labor, and Thomas became known for an extraordinary capacity to dictate material, sometimes on more than one subject, to those who wrote for him. The finished form of the Summa can look immovable, but its production passed through voices, ink, scraped skins, corrections, and the fatigue of human attention. Reginald of Pippino, Thomas's companion and secretary, belongs especially to the later memory of this labor. He served Thomas closely, preserved parts of his work, and became one of the witnesses through whom later generations understood the final years of Aquinas's life. A medieval master depended on such men more than modern habits of authorship may suggest. The name on the work was Thomas's, and the mind arranging it was Thomas's. But the daily act of turning thought into durable text involved a small world of listening, writing, carrying, and keeping. The structure of the Summa follows the scholastic habit that had shaped Thomas in Paris. It moves through questions and articles. Each article begins with objections, then gives a contrary authority, then Thomas's own answer, followed by replies to the objections. The pattern is repeated so steadily that it becomes almost a form of breathing for the work. Difficulty first, authority next, answer after that, replies at the end. The arrangement allowed Thomas to teach not only conclusions, but the movement by which a trained mind should reach them. This form also protected the dignity of objections. Thomas did not treat opposing arguments as interruptions to be hidden. They appear at the front of each article, sometimes with enough force that a reader can feel the real pressure they placed on doctrine. Then Thomas answers by distinction, placement, and ordered reasoning. He rarely dismisses a difficulty with impatience. He gives it a location within the larger truth. The method is one reason the Summa endured as a teaching work. It trained readers in a habit of intellectual charity toward problems. The first part of the Summa begins with God. After asking about the nature of sacred doctrine and whether God exists, Thomas moves into questions about divine simplicity, perfection, goodness, infinity, knowledge, will, power, and the life of God. From there, the work turns toward creation, angels, the 6 days, the human person, and divine governance. This movement is not casual. Theology begins with God because all other things are understood in relation to Him. Creation is not the first subject, it is the first effect. Aquinas's God in the Summa is not introduced as a large creature above other creatures. God is simple, without parts, not composed of essence and existence, not dependent on anything outside himself. Such claims can feel distant from ordinary devotion, but for Thomas they protected the mystery of God from being reduced to one item inside the world. If God is the source of being, then God cannot be understood as merely the highest being in a chain. The language of the Summa is technical because the subject requires the mind to be cleansed of easy images. The second broad movement of the work turns toward human action. Thomas examines happiness, voluntary action, passions, habits, virtues, vices, law, grace, and the moral life in a sequence of extraordinary range. Here the Aristotelian inheritance becomes especially visible. Human beings act for ends. Virtue is a stable habit. Happiness is not a passing mood, but the fulfillment toward which human nature is ordered. Yet the Christian shape of the work remains decisive, because final beatitude exceeds what natural human powers can achieve. Grace does not destroy nature, it heals, elevates, and completes it. This portion of the Summa shows Thomas as more than a metaphysician of God's existence. He was also a careful reader of human conduct. He asked why people choose, how passions affect judgment, what makes law rational, how virtues differ from one another, and why moral formation requires repeated action. The page can be technical, but the questions belong to ordinary life. Anger, fear, friendship, justice, courage, prudence, despair, hope, obedience, pride, and charity all enter the field of sacred doctrine. Theology, in Thomas's hands, did not float above human action. It entered the habits by which a life is formed. The third part turns to Christ and the sacraments. Here, the order of the work moves from God and creation, through human return to God, into the means by which that return is made possible in Christian teaching. Thomas writes about the incarnation, the life of Christ, his passion, resurrection, and the sacramental life of the Church. The work remained unfinished before he completed the full treatment of the sacraments and the last things. Later supplements were added from his earlier writings, but the unfinished edge of the Summa became part of its history. The great book does not end as neatly as its structure might lead one to expect. Its scale can obscure the fact that Thomas wrote under pressure. He taught, traveled, answered questions, served the needs of his order, and composed other works while the Summa grew. Medieval intellectual labor was not a life of uninterrupted quiet. A Dominican master could be moved by obedience, drawn into controversy, asked to advise, required to preach, or summoned into institutional duties. The work accumulated inside a life of service. Its order was not produced by isolation alone. One of the most striking features of the Summa is its confidence that everything can be placed somewhere. God, angels, matter, soul, law, grace, vice, virtue, Christ, sacraments, and the destiny of human beings are not treated as scattered topics. They belong within one ordered vision. This does not mean Thomas thought every mystery could be made transparent. He often insists that God exceeds human comprehension, but he also believed that the mind could receive real order from revelation and reason together. Mystery did not excuse confusion. For students, such order had practical value. A young theologian needed to know where a question belonged before he could answer it well. Confusion often comes from placing a problem in the wrong field. A question about nature should not be answered as though it were only a question about grace. A question about human law should not be confused with eternal law. A question about Christ's humanity should not erase his divinity. Thomas's distinctions guided the learner away from false collisions by showing which level of reality was being discussed. The Summa also reveals Thomas's trust in the teachability of truth. He did not write only to display mastery. He wrote as one responsible for forming other minds. That responsibility shaped the work's rhythm, its repeated structure, and its careful sequencing. Each article is small enough to be handled, yet each belongs to a larger pattern. The student moves by steps. The steps are demanding, but they are steps. Thomas's greatness as a teacher lies partly in this refusal to leave the learner impressed but lost. The work's authority grew long after Thomas's death, but its beginning belongs to the labor of a living friar with students before him. The Summa started as an answer to a pedagogical need inside the Dominican world and the wider schools. It gave theology a path through its own abundance. Its pages carried the memory of Parisian disputation, Aristotelian precision, monastic patience, and Dominican usefulness. The quiet boy once sent to Monte Cassino had become a master arranging sacred doctrine for those who would come after him. As the Summa began, Thomas's life did not narrow into writing alone. The same mind that ordered questions on God and creation also served courts, friars, students, and the public worship of the church. His theology moved from classroom to pulpit, from manuscript to chant, from university argument to the practical needs of Christian devotion. The book was becoming vast, but the life around it remained active, obedient, and mobile, carrying him through the work of teaching in a world where kings, friars, and popes all had need of learned men. Chapter 12: Kings, Friars, and the Labor of Teaching. The life of Thomas Aquinas was never confined to one desk, one classroom, or one book. Even while the Summa Theologiae grew under his hand and through the work of those who wrote for him, he remained a friar under obedience, a teacher required by students, a theologian useful to the church, and a member of an order whose mission did not permit learning to remain private. The image of Aquinas as a thinker seated among manuscripts is true but incomplete. His mind worked inside institutions that moved him from city to city, from school to court, from lecture to sermon, from disputed question to practical counsel. Dominican life gave study a purpose beyond the scholar's own perfection. The order of preachers had been founded because preaching needed doctrine, and doctrine needed disciplined minds. Thomas belonged to that mission. His work was not meant to produce a solitary system admired by a few learned men. It was meant to form teachers, strengthen preaching, answer error, guide conscience, and make sacred doctrine more intelligible to those responsible for carrying it into the life of the church. A Dominican theologian served with words, and the service required both depth and clarity. This helps explain the range of Aquinas' labor. He wrote commentaries on Scripture, commentaries on Aristotle, disputed questions, theological treatises, works for students, replies to specific problems, and texts connected to public worship. Some works rose from the ordinary rhythm of teaching. Others answered needs brought by superiors, patrons, or ecclesiastical authorities. The medieval scholar did not always choose his subjects by private preference. Requests arrived, controversies demanded attention, students needed instruction. The work of the mind was woven into obedience. Papal courts in the 13th century were not fixed in one permanent capital in the modern administrative sense. Popes and their households moved among Italian cities, and the business of the church moved with them. Theologians, canonists, clerks, ambassadors, petitioners, and officials gathered around these courts because decisions made there could affect kingdoms, dioceses, religious orders, monasteries, and universities. Thomas spent periods in Italy in connection with this wider ecclesiastical world, teaching in Dominican houses and serving needs that reached beyond the classroom. His life remained mobile because the church he served was mobile. Urban IV, Pope from 1261 to 1264, belongs to one of the most memorable traditions connected with Aquinas' public service. The Feast of Corpus Christi, devoted to the Eucharist, was extended to the Universal Church during Urban's pontificate, and Thomas has long been associated with the composition of liturgical texts for the feast. Historical details around the commission have been discussed by scholars, but the tradition itself has carried enormous weight in Catholic memory. It gives a different view of Aquinas from the one found in metaphysical argument. Here the theologian writes for worship. The hymns associated with Corpus Christi show theology entering song. In works such as Pange Lingua, Sacris Solemnis, and Verbum Supernum, doctrine does not appear in the shape of objections and replies. It appears in rhythm, chant, and liturgical memory. The Eucharist, which Thomas treated with careful precision in his scholastic writing, also became the subject of words meant to be sung by the Church. This is worth pausing over, because it reminds us that medieval theology did not live only on the page. It passed through voices in chapels, processions, choirs, and feast days. Aquinas' Eucharistic theology carried the influence of Aristotle in a form that entered ordinary devotion. The distinction between substance and accidents, drawn from philosophical language, helped him explain how bread and wine could remain sensibly bread and wine while becoming, according to Catholic doctrine, the body and blood of Christ. This was not an abstract puzzle for its own sake. The Eucharist stood at the center of Christian worship. The careful language of the school served the altar, and the altar gave the careful language its sacred urgency. The same theologian who wrote compact arguments for God's existence and dense articles on divine simplicity also wrote words that generations would sing without knowing the full structure of his metaphysics. That double presence matters. Thomas was never only the property of university masters. His thought flowed into forms that ordinary worshippers could receive, even if they never read the Summa. A hymn could carry doctrine differently from a disputation. It did not argue each point, but it placed belief inside memory, melody, and repeated prayer. Royal and political questions also entered Aquinas' work, though he should not be turned into a court politician. He wrote on kingship, law, and government because Christian life was lived under rulers, customs, jurisdictions, and public authority. Medieval theology did not treat politics as a secular island separated from moral order. A king's rule, a law's justice, a community's peace, and the common good all belong to ethical reflection. Thomas approached such subjects through the same habit of order that shaped his theology. Authority had purpose. Law had reason. Rule existed for the good of those ruled. His unfinished work, De Regno, often known as On Kingship, was addressed to a king of Cyprus and reflects the medieval concern with just rule, tyranny, and the common good. Thomas did not romanticize power. He understood that monarchy could serve unity, but also that corrupt rule could become destructive when ordered to the ruler's private benefit rather than the community's good. His treatment of political authority grew from older sources, including Aristotle, Scripture, Augustine, and the practical realities of medieval government. Once again, he did not discard philosophy when speaking as a theologian. He placed it within a Christian moral horizon. Law became one of his great subjects in the Summa. Eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law each received a place in his account. Human law, for Thomas, was not merely the command of whoever held power. It had to be an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by legitimate authority and promulgated. That definition would echo through centuries of legal and moral thought. Its calm phrasing can hide its force. A ruler's command was not enough. Law had to be rational, public, and ordered toward a good beyond private will. Such ideas were not detached from the world around him. The 13th century was full of rulers, city governments, ecclesiastical courts, feudal claims, royal administrations, and disputes over jurisdiction. Frederick II's kingdom had shown Thomas from childhood that law and power mattered. Paris had shown him that institutions fought over rights and privileges. The church itself governed through canon law and papal authority. Aquinas' account of law came from a mind trained in metaphysics, but it also answered a world in which authority had to be judged and ordered. Teaching remained the thread through all of this. Thomas moved between high subjects without losing the posture of a master responsible for learners. Whether speaking of God, kingship, Eucharist, virtue, or law, he tried to arrange material so that the mind could proceed without confusion. This did not make his work easy. It made it navigable. The distinction matters. A difficult road can still be marked carefully, and Thomas had an unusual gift for placing markers where students would need them. His students and fellow friars would have known the labor behind this clarity. Teaching required preparation, repetition, correction, and endurance. A master had to lecture from texts, preside over questions, respond to difficulties, and continue writing for audiences both present and absent. The Dominican day joined prayer and study, but neither was weightless. A friar's body carried the labor of travel, fasting, public speaking, listening, and dictation. Medieval scholarship was not a life of pure abstraction. It had tired hands, strained memory, crowded rooms, and pages that had to be made before they could be read. The papal and royal connections in Thomas's life should therefore be understood through service rather than ambition. He did not become a bishop or abbot. He did not turn his learning into a climb through ecclesiastical office. That absence is notable because men of his birth and ability could have been drawn into such paths. Instead, his authority grew through teaching and writing. The power attached to his name came not from jurisdiction over a diocese, but from the capacity of his thought to serve those who did hold office, preach sermons, judge cases, teach students, and care for souls. There is a quiet consistency here with the decision that had once alarmed his family. The Aquinos had feared that the Dominican path would waste the social promise of a noble son. In worldly terms, Thomas did step away from the kind of office his family may have imagined. Yet he entered a form of service that carried his influence farther than an abbacy might have done. Monte Cassino could have given him a great house. The Dominicans gave him a road through the intellectual life of Europe. Aquinas's work also reveals how medieval categories of thought crossed boundaries that modern habits often separate. Philosophy could aid theology. Theology could shape law. Law could serve moral formation. Liturgy could carry doctrine. Politics could be judged by reason and charity. Teaching could be an act of religious obedience. These crossings were not signs of confusion. For Thomas, they belonged to a world in which all truth ultimately had one source, even when the disciplines that approached it differed in method and dignity. This confidence did not make his life peaceful in any simple sense. The same mendicant identity that gave him mobility and mission also placed him within controversy. Dominicans and Franciscans remained objects of suspicion for many secular masters and clergy, especially in the university world. Their poverty, privileges, and papal support made them powerful and resented at once. Thomas could write for popes, teach students, compose hymns, and serve his order, but he still belonged to a religious movement whose place in Christendom had to be defended. By this stage of his life, Aquinas had become one of the strongest minds available to that defense. The quiet student of Cologne was now a master whose learning could answer not only philosophical questions, but institutional attacks. His life among kings, friars, popes, students, and liturgical commissions had widened his authority. Yet the very order he served was still contested, and the next great struggle would turn again toward the university world, where the presence of mendicant friars as teachers had become impossible for their opponents to ignore. Chapter 13. The controversy over the mendicants. The controversy over the mendicants had begun before Thomas Aquinas became one of its most important defenders. Dominicans and Franciscans had entered the university world with speed, confidence, and papal support, and their presence unsettled men who believed the older order of academic life was being changed too quickly. A friar could be poor, obedient to a religious superior, protected by privileges from Rome, and still hold a chair in theology at Paris. To supporters of the new orders, this looked like renewal. To their critics, it looked like an invasion of the schools. Paris gave the dispute its sharpest edge because Paris was not merely one city among others. Its university stood near the center of Latin theological authority, and a master who taught there spoke to more than the students sitting before him. His arguments could move into sermons, episcopal council, religious instruction, and future classrooms across Europe. If mendicant friars held strong positions in Paris, then their influence would not remain inside their convents. It would travel through the trained minds of those they taught. The secular masters had reasons for concern that should not be dismissed too quickly. They were not all enemies of holiness, and they were not simply jealous men protecting privilege. Many had spent years earning their place within the university. They belonged to the clerical world, but not to mendicant orders. and they could see that friars lived under a different structure of obedience. A Dominican master answered not only to the university, but to his order. A Franciscan did the same. To some secular masters, this raised a serious question about loyalty, authority, and the proper independence of the schools. William of St. Amour became the most famous voice against the friars. He was a master of theology at Paris and a determined critic of mendicant influence. His writings attacked the place of the friars in the church and university, especially their claims to teach, preach, hear confessions, and live by begging while holding public religious authority. His opposition was not a passing complaint. It became a campaign over what kinds of religious life should be trusted, and whether the new orders had distorted older expectations of clerical service. The dispute touched poverty first of all. Mendicant poverty was different from monastic property held in common by a stable house. Dominicans and Franciscans could present their dependence as a return to apostolic life, a way of preaching without the burdens of landholding and inherited wealth. Critics saw danger in that same dependence. A man who lived from alms while exercising influence might seem free from the ordinary responsibilities that tied clergy and institutions to settled communities. Poverty, which the friars considered evangelical strength, could be described by opponents as instability. Preaching made the matter more urgent. Parish clergy had long-standing responsibilities toward their communities, and bishops held authority over diocesan life. Mendicant friars, protected by papal privileges, could preach and hear confessions in ways that sometimes appeared to bypass local structures. Their supporters argued that the needs of souls justified their work, especially in growing towns where old patterns of pastoral care were not always sufficient. Opponents worried that such privileges weakened ordinary clergy and disturbed the proper order of the church. A debate over poverty widened into a debate over jurisdiction. The university question was just as sensitive. The schools had their own customs, ranks, examinations, and corporate identity. If religious orders could place their men inside this system while also remaining strongly governed by their own superiors, the balance of power might change. Secular masters feared that the friars could use papal favor and religious organization to dominate theological teaching. The mendicants replied that learning belonged to the service of truth, not to the preservation of one academic group's position. The result was a conflict in which institutional rights and spiritual ideals became difficult to separate. Thomas Aquinas entered this controversy as a Dominican whose whole life answered many of the accusations made against the order. He was poor by vow, obedient to his superiors, devoted to study, and formed for teaching. His own family had once treated mendicant life as a descent from noble expectation, and now university critics treated it as a danger to ecclesiastical order. The objection had changed its setting, but not all of its substance. Again, Thomas had to defend the kind of life he had chosen. His defense of the mendicants did not rely on noise or personal attack. He approached the matter through the ordered tools of theology and law. Religious poverty, he argued, could serve the perfection of Christian life when rightly understood. The friars did not reject the church's structure by their poverty. They served within it under papal approval and religious rule. Their preaching and teaching were not acts of wandering self-authorization, because their order had been recognized by the church. To attack them as inherently illegitimate was to disregard the authority that had approved their way of life. The conflict with William of St. Amour gave this defense a concrete target. William's work against the friars was eventually condemned, but the ideas behind it did not disappear at once. The mendicants had to continue defending their presence because suspicion remained useful to those who felt displaced by them. Thomas's replies belonged to this wider defense. He treated the arguments against religious poverty, teaching, and mendicant ministry as serious enough to require careful answer. The friars' place in the schools could not rest only on papal documents. It also had to be made intelligible. One of the deeper issues concerned perfection. In medieval religious language, a state of perfection referred especially to a life ordered by vows toward charity and the service of God. Monks had long represented one form of that life. The mendicants claimed another. Their poverty was not an accidental hardship, but part of their chosen religious structure. Thomas defended the idea that poverty could free a preacher for the work of teaching and the care of souls, provided it was joined to discipline and obedience. Poverty alone did not make a man holy. Ordered poverty could remove certain burdens that hindered a particular mission. This distinction mattered because critics could portray friars as idle beggars with spiritual pretensions. Thomas answered by placing poverty within purpose. The Dominican did not beg in order to avoid labor. He accepted poverty so that he could be assigned, moved, taught, corrected, and sent where the order's work required him. His life was not rootless self-direction. It was a different form of institutional discipline. The friar's lack of property made sense only inside the rule, study, and mission that governed him. Aquinas' defense also protected teaching as a religious work. The life of perfection did not exclude intellectual labor. For the Dominicans, study belonged to charity because it prepared the friar to preach truth and answer error. A theologian in the order was not abandoning humility by teaching. He was using his gifts in service of others. This point had personal force in Thomas's life, but he did not argue it as autobiography. He argued from the nature of religious life, the needs of the church, and the legitimacy of papally approved orders. The controversy reveals how active the 13th century church was beneath its surface of inherited forms. New orders did not simply appear and settle into their places. They had to fight for recognition, not only from popes, but from those whose lives their presence disturbed. Universities were not neutral halls of pure inquiry. They were institutions where honor, income, jurisdiction, doctrine, and spiritual authority crossed. In such a setting, even poverty could become political. Thomas's role in the dispute strengthened his position as a public theologian. He was no longer only explaining Aristotle, commenting on Lombard, or arranging sacred doctrine for students. He was defending the legitimacy of the very religious form that had made his career possible. The issue reached back to his youth and forward into the future of the church. If the mendicants were excluded from teaching, the Dominican intellectual mission would be wounded at its center. If they were accepted, theology itself would increasingly be shaped by friars who lived between university and pulpit. Papal authority proved decisive in the broader conflict. The mendicant orders had received approval from Rome, and that approval gave them a strength their opponents could not simply override. Yet papal protection did not remove the need for argument. Medieval institutions could be legally authorized and still socially contested. Thomas understood this. His defense worked not only to secure a right, but to show why the right made sense within the order of Christian life. The struggle over mendicants also sharpened Aquinas' understanding of the relation between contemplation and action. A Dominican studied in order to preach, and preached from the fruits of contemplation. The phrase often associated with Dominican life, to hand on to others what has been contemplated, captures the movement. Thomas's theology served exactly that pattern. He received, ordered, examined, and then taught. His books did not close around him like a private enclosure. They opened outward into the work of the order. The controversy did not end all suspicion of the friars, but it confirmed their place in the intellectual life of Europe. Dominicans and Franciscans would remain central to university theology, sometimes in agreement, often in rivalry, and always within the demanding atmosphere of the schools. Thomas's own defense became part of that settlement. The order his family had feared had now become an order whose place in the university he helped justify before some of the sharpest critics of his age. After the dispute, Thomas's life continued to move between writing, teaching, and obedience. The arguments over mendicant poverty had shown how closely his personal vocation was tied to the institutional future of the Dominicans. Yet another movement was beginning. The mature master who had defended his order and built the great architecture of the Summa would return once more toward Naples, where the city of his youth would receive him not as a student discovering his path, but as a teacher nearing the final and unfinished labor of his life. Chapter 14. Naples, Preaching, and the Unfinished Book. Naples received Thomas Aquinas again near the end of his working life, but the city no longer held him as it had held him in youth. When he first studied there, he had been a noble son moving through a future still partly imagined by his family. Aristotle was new to him. The Dominicans had appeared as a demanding possibility, and the shape of his vocation had not yet been tested by family opposition. Now he returned as a master of theology, a Dominican of European reputation, and the author of works already spreading through the learned world. The city of first encounter became the city of final labor. The southern Italian world had also changed around him. Frederick II was gone, and the political order of the region had passed through violent struggle into Angevin rule under Charles of Anjou. Naples stood within a kingdom whose rulers, clerics, officials, and religious houses all belonged to the complicated settlement that followed the fall of the Hohenstaufen line. Thomas did not return as a political actor at the center of that new order, but the setting mattered. The same region that had once tied his family to imperial and papal tensions now placed his mature work inside another arrangement of power. Dominican obedience brought him there. Around 1272, Thomas was assigned to establish or direct a Dominican studium in Naples, where the order needed serious teaching for its friars. This was not a retirement from intellectual life. It was a continuation of the same mission that had carried him through Paris, Cologne, Rome, Orvieto, and other centers of study. The order of preachers required men who could teach doctrine with strength and steadiness, and Thomas remained one of its greatest resources. Even in the final years, his work was not merely private writing. It belonged to an order that had students to form. The Naples Studium represented the Dominican commitment to education outside the most famous university centers. Not every friar could study at Paris. Not every province could depend on distant masters. Houses of study were needed in many places, and each had to connect the order's preaching mission with trained theological judgment. Thomas's presence gave the Neapolitan school unusual weight. A young friar studying under him stood close to one of the most exact minds in Christendom, yet the immediate task remained humble. Lectures, questions, explanations, correction, and the repeated labor of forming students. Teaching in Naples also brought Thomas near the language and landscape of his early life. He was again in the south, closer to Roccasecca and the noble world he had left behind. The contrast is gentle but striking. His family had once hoped to shape his religious future through a great Benedictine house, perhaps through Monte Cassino and the older prestige of monastic authority. Instead, the path they resisted had brought him back to the region as a Dominican master. He possessed no abbey, no inherited office, no noble command. His authority rested in teaching. That authority had become immense, though Thomas himself did not carry it as worldly display. He continued writing, dictating, lecturing, and preaching. The Summa Theologiae was still unfinished, and its third part occupied him during this final period. Having treated God, creation, human action, law, grace, virtue, and vice, he had turned to Christ and the sacraments. The work had moved from the first source of all being toward the means by which human beings return to God in Christian doctrine. Its order was approaching the heart of worship. The third part of the Summa shows Thomas writing about the Incarnation, with the same careful discipline he had brought to divine simplicity and human virtue. He asks why it was fitting for God to become human, how Christ's divine and human natures are united, what belongs to his knowledge, his will, his suffering, and his mission. These questions could easily become either abstract or sentimental. Thomas makes them neither. He treats the Incarnation as mystery, but a mystery whose terms must be guarded with precision because careless speech about Christ could wound the center of Christian faith. From Christ, the work moves toward the sacraments. This was not a secondary subject for Aquinas. The sacraments were the visible means by which divine grace touched human life through the Church. They belonged to theology, liturgy, pastoral care, and ordinary Christian existence at once. Baptism, Eucharist, penance, and the other sacraments were not distant ideas to be contemplated only by masters. They were rites performed over infants, sinners, the sick, the married, the ordained, and the dying. In them, doctrine met bodies, words, water, oil, bread, wine, confession, absolution, and communal memory. Thomas wrote especially deeply on the Eucharist. His earlier liturgical compositions for Corpus Christi had already shown his capacity to turn Eucharistic doctrine into sung prayer. In the Summa, the treatment becomes scholastic and exact. He asks about the presence of Christ, the change of bread and wine, the meaning of substance and accidents, the fittingness of the sacrament, and the way it nourishes the Christian life. The language can be technical, but the subject was central to medieval devotion. A distinction made in the schools served the mystery enacted at the altar. Naples therefore held Thomas at a point where his thought was both highest and most practical. Christology and sacramental theology required metaphysical care, yet they also belonged to preaching, confession, worship, and the religious instruction of ordinary Christians. This combination suited his Dominican vocation. The friar who studied Aristotle did so not to remain inside philosophy, but to serve the truth preached and celebrated by the Church. The teacher in Naples carried that whole path into his final classroom. His preaching also continued. Medieval preaching by a theologian of Thomas's rank was not casual exhortation. It drew from scripture, doctrine, moral instruction, and the liturgical calendar. A sermon had to be intelligible to hearers who were not university masters, yet it could not betray the truth by simplification that distorted it. Aquinas' sermons, where preserved or attributed with varying degrees of certainty, show another face of his teaching life. They remind us that his words were not meant only for pages arranged in articles. Some were meant to be heard. The physical labor behind this work should not be forgotten. Thomas traveled, taught, dictated, prayed, preached, and continued composing at a pace that seems severe even by medieval standards. His body had carried years of study and movement. The image of him as purely intellectual can make the life seem almost weightless. But no manuscript appeared without effort. Dictation required concentration, teaching required presence, travel required endurance. Religious life required the offices and obligations of the order. The final years were full of work, not detached contemplation alone. Reginald of Pippano remained close to him in this period. As companion, secretary, and later witness, Reginald's role became essential to the memory of Aquinas' last months. He was near enough to hear the words by which Thomas would explain his silence. He also belonged to the practical world that made Thomas's work possible, the world of secretaries, assistants, fellow friars, and students who received thought as it was spoken and helped preserve it after the master could no longer continue. Great books often carry hidden communities inside them. At Naples, the unfinished character of the Summa was not yet the historical fact it later became. It was still a work in progress. Thomas continued to move through its questions, and nothing in the ordinary rhythm of his labor announced that the structure would remain incomplete. The third part had reached the sacraments, but not the full treatment he intended. Later generations would supplement the missing sections from his earlier writings, but that supplement is itself a sign of absence. The master's own ordering hand stopped before the work reached its planned end. The interruption came in December 1273. According to the tradition preserved through those close to him, Thomas experienced something after celebrating Mass that changed his relation to his writing. The nature of the experience remains beyond historical recovery. It has been called a vision, a revelation, a mystical encounter, or an inward event known only through its effect. The historian must be careful here. The event belongs partly to testimony and partly to the silence it produced. What can be said plainly is that after it, Thomas ceased writing. Before that silence, Naples had gathered the strands of his life in a remarkable way. The region of his birth had become the region of his final teaching. The city of youthful exposure to Aristotle had become the city where Aristotelian language served Christian sacramental theology. The Dominican order his family had feared had become the institution through which he formed students near his old world. The Summa begun as a guide for learners, had grown into a vast ordering of sacred doctrine and now stood near its unfinished edge. There is no need to make this moment more dramatic than it already is. Thomas was not abandoning reason because reason had failed. He was not rejecting theology because theology had become useless. His entire life argued against such easy conclusions. The silence that approached belonged to a man who had spent himself in the service of ordered truth. It did not erase the work. It placed the work under a final judgment that came from within his own spiritual life, expressed not as a new book, but as the refusal to continue the old one. Naples, then, was not merely another station in his career. It became the place where the great architecture of his thought met its limit. The teacher still had students, the friar still had obedience, the manuscript still had unfinished questions before it, yet something in Thomas had changed, and Reginald would soon hear words that later readers would repeat with wonder. The master who had written so much, and arranged so much, and answered so many objections, would say that he could write no more. Chapter 15. The Silence After the Vision. Thomas Aquinas had spent his life giving speech to difficult things. He had written about God with a caution that refused easy images, about creation with the language of act and potency, about human action through law, virtue, grace, and desire, and about Christ and the sacraments with a precision meant to guard mystery rather than reduce it. His mind had moved through objections and replies with remarkable steadiness. Then, near the end of 1273, after years of ordered labor, that movement stopped. The event is traditionally placed on December 6th, the feast of St. Nicholas, after Thomas had celebrated Mass in Naples. The sources do not allow the historian to enter the moment directly. They preserve its aftermath, and the aftermath is striking enough. Thomas, who had dictated and written with extraordinary energy, no longer continued the Summa Theologiae. The great work remained unfinished in its third part, still moving through the sacraments, still short of the full ending he had planned. A theologian whose life had been shaped by words answered the experience with silence. Reginald of Pippano, his close companion and secretary, becomes essential here. Without Reginald, the final months of Thomas's life would be much harder to see. He had worked beside Aquinas, heard his dictation, helped preserve his writings, and accompanied him through the practical demands of travel and teaching. When Thomas stopped writing, Reginald was near enough to notice not only the absence of new text, but the change in the man who had once produced it. The secretary who had carried his words now became the witness to their end. The famous statement attributed to Thomas is remembered in different forms, but its meaning remains steady. He told Reginald that he could write no more, because everything he had written seemed like straw compared with what had been revealed to him. The phrase has passed through centuries with unusual force. It can be misunderstood if read as contempt for his own work, as if Thomas had suddenly decided that reason, theology, and careful teaching were worthless. That is too simple. His silence did not cancel his life. It belonged to the same life, and that makes it more difficult and more moving. For Thomas, writing had never been an act of vanity. He wrote under obedience, for students, for the church, for the needs of doctrine, and for the ordering of minds toward truth. He had not spent decades building a private monument to his own intelligence. The Summa itself had been intended as a teaching work, a path for beginners in sacred doctrine. If, after the December experience, he judged his writing differently, the judgment came from a man who already understood both the value and the limits of human words. He knew language could serve truth. He also knew that God exceeded every form the mind could make. This balance is important because later readers often want the final silence to solve Aquinas too quickly. Some want it to prove that mystical experience defeats theology. Others want to soften it until it becomes only exhaustion or illness. The sources do not permit certainty of that kind. Thomas may have been physically worn down, spiritually altered, or both. Medieval witnesses understood the change through religious categories, and those categories should not be brushed aside merely because they are difficult for modern habits. At the same time, the historian must not pretend to possess the vision itself. The evidence gives the silence, the reported words, and the unfinished book. The silence came after Mass, which matters within the shape of his life. Aquinas had written so much about the Eucharist that the altar and the page were already joined in his work. In the Summa, he treated the sacrament through questions of substance, presence, change, sign, grace, and worship. In the hymns associated with Corpus Christi, Eucharistic theology had become chant and devotion. If the final experience occurred in the context of Mass, it brought him again to the point where doctrine and worship met. The theologian of the Eucharist stopped writing after standing within the rite his theology had served. Naples continued around him, but his labor had changed. Students still needed teaching. Friars still lived under the order's rhythm. Manuscripts still contained unfinished questions. Reginald still had the habits of a secretary ready to receive words. None of that restored the old movement. The Summa did not resume. The final part broke off before Thomas completed the sacraments and the last things in the full form he had intended. Later readers would fill the gap with a supplement drawn from earlier writings, but they could not make the work end as Thomas would have ended it. The unfinished state of the Summa has its own quiet power. A work built with such order might seem destined for completion. Its structure moves with confidence, and each part seems to know where the next should go. Yet the book stops. The mind that had arranged so many questions did not arrange the final ones. This has made the Summa feel, to many generations, both more human and more mysterious. It is not only a monument of thought, it is the work of a living man whose strength, obedience, and speech had limits. The limits did not remove his authority. In the months after the experience, Thomas remained a Dominican friar under obedience. He did not become a wandering visionary outside the Church's order. He did not found a new movement around his silence. He did not turn against the schools that had formed him. His final period remained enclosed within the same religious life he had chosen as a young man against his family's wishes. Even silence for Thomas occurred inside obedience. That obedience soon required travel. Pope Gregory X had called a council at Lyon, intended to address grave matters for the Church, including relations with the Greek Church, reform, and the needs of crusading policy. Thomas was summoned to attend, a sign of the authority his learning held in the wider Church. Even after he had stopped writing the Summa, others still needed his mind and presence. The summons drew him away from Naples and onto the road northward. The journey itself carried symbolic weight without needing to be forced into symbol. Thomas had moved throughout his life, from Roccasecca to Monte Cassino, from Monte Cassino to Naples, from Naples into the Dominican order, from family confinement to Cologne, from Cologne to Paris, from Paris through Italian houses of study and papal circles, and back to Naples again. Now he traveled once more, not toward a new school or a new book, but toward a council he would never reach. The road that had carried his vocation outward was nearing its last stage. Accounts of his health in this period suggest weakness, and some traditions mention an accident or injury during the journey. The details vary, and the physical facts should be handled with restraint. What matters for the Chronicle is that Thomas, no longer in the full strength of his working life, was moving under obedience toward Lyon when his condition worsened. He was brought to the Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova, a religious house south of Rome, where monks received him in his final illness. Before Fossanova, the silence after the vision had already altered the meaning of his last days. The man who arrived there was not simply an exhausted scholar, he was the author of an unfinished work, the theologian who had stopped after saying that his writings seemed small beside what he had seen. The monks who received him received a Dominican master whose name had already traveled farther than his body could now go. He came not with a completed system in his hands, but with a life of teaching behind him and no new work ahead. There is a temptation to make his final silence into a dramatic rejection of the intellect, but Thomas's own life resists that reading. He had never believed the intellect could contain God as a vessel contains water. He had always taught that human language about God was limited, analogical, and dependent on what creatures could reveal imperfectly. His final words to Reginald, if faithfully remembered, did not introduce a new humility into his theology. They revealed the humility that had been there all along, now pressed into a more absolute form. The December experience also brings into view the difference between knowledge and possession. Thomas had known much, perhaps more than any theologian of his century in the ordered range of his work. Yet to know truly is not the same as to possess completely. Sacred doctrine, as he understood it, gave real knowledge of God, but not exhaustive comprehension. The mind could rise by reason, receive revelation by faith, and speak carefully through doctrine, but God remained greater than the mind's grasp. The silence after the vision stands at that boundary. Reginald's presence gives the moment its human scale. The secretary, who had once waited for dictation, now heard refusal. The man accustomed to preserving Thomas's speech had to preserve the fact that speech had ceased. A great intellectual life often looks, from a distance, like a series of books, arguments, and public achievements. Near the end, it became something smaller and more intimate, one friar speaking to another, one companion trying to understand why the master would not continue, one unfinished manuscript left behind. As Thomas moved toward Fossa Nova, the work of interpretation began before his life had ended. His companions had to understand the change. His order had to preserve the writings. Later, theologians would have to decide what to do with the unfinished Summa. Admirers would repeat the words about straw, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with confusion. Critics and defenders would both find meanings in the silence. But Thomas himself did not turn the event into a theory. He stopped writing, obeyed the summons placed before him, and continued toward the road that led to his final resting place. The silence after the vision, therefore, belongs neither to defeat nor triumph. It belongs to completion of another kind, though not the completion of the manuscript. Aquinas had spent his life arranging what could be arranged: arguments, authorities, questions, distinctions, doctrines, and paths for students. At the end, he encountered the limit beyond which arrangement could not carry him in the old way. The next chapter of his life would not be written by his own hand. It would unfold at Fossa Nova, among Cistercian monks, where the Dominican master came to the end of his journey and the long afterlife of Thomas Aquinas began. Chapter 16, Fossa Nova and the long afterlife of Thomas Fossa Nova received Thomas Aquinas because the road to Lyon had become too much for him. He had set out in obedience to the summons of Pope Gregory X, who wanted him at the council that would gather bishops, theologians, envoys, and churchmen around some of the great concerns of the age. Thomas did not reach it. The journey that had carried him away from Naples brought him instead to a Cistercian abbey in the countryside south of Rome, where another religious order, older in form than the Dominicans, took him in during his final illness. The setting was not the world of Parisian disputation or royal Naples. Fossa Nova belonged to the Cistercian tradition, a reforming monastic movement that had sought simplicity, discipline, and a stricter form of communal life. Its stone buildings, cloistered order, and liturgical rhythm stood closer to the monastic world Thomas had known as a child than to the university schools where he became famous. There is a quiet symmetry in that return. The boy once sent toward Monte Cassino ended his life among monks, though he remained to the end a son of the order of preachers. Thomas arrived at Fossa Nova weakened, no longer the tireless master of dictation and dispute. The accounts of his last days carry the reverent tone of men who knew they were close to someone already regarded as holy and learned. He was not treated as an unknown traveler. His name had moved through Dominican houses, university circles, and ecclesiastical courts. The Cistercians who received him understood that the sick friar in their care was one of the strongest theologians of the age, even if his body had reached the end of its strength. The last illness of a medieval religious figure often gathered memory around itself. Later readers wanted final words, final gestures, and final signs that could reveal the meaning of the whole life. Thomas's death was remembered in that way, but the broad outline remains simple. He was cared for at Fossa Nova, received the rites of the church, and died on March 7, 1274. He was not yet 50 years old. A life that later seemed vast had been, in years, relatively brief. His age matters because the scale of his work can make him feel older than he was. By the time he died, Thomas had written commentaries on Scripture and Aristotle, disputed questions, theological treatises, sermons, liturgical texts, and the unfinished Summa Theologiae. He had taught in Paris and Italy, studied under Albert the Great, defended the mendicants, and given Christian theology one of its most durable intellectual forms. All of this had been done within roughly half a century of life. The manuscripts outlived the body that had carried them into being. At Fossa Nova, the unfinished state of the Summa remained one of the facts surrounding his death. He did not complete the sacraments, and he did not write the final treatment of the last things in the form he had planned. Later editors and students would attach a supplement drawn from earlier writings, so that readers could move through a more complete theological arc. But the supplement never fully erases the break. The work remains marked by the silence that stopped it. The absence became part of its presence. The Cistercian monks kept his body, and the question of his remains later became part of the story of his reputation. Medieval bodies of saints and holy figures were not treated as private remains in the modern sense. They could become objects of devotion, sources of institutional prestige, and signs of spiritual connection. Religious houses cared deeply about where such bodies rested. Thomas's body, like his writings, did not belong only to one immediate circle for long. His death opened questions of memory, honor, and possession. The first afterlife of Aquinas was Dominican. His own order preserved his memory with gratitude and pride. The young nobleman whose family had once resisted the friars had become one of the order's great intellectual witnesses. His life confirmed the Dominican claim that study could serve preaching, that poverty could sustain learning, and that the schools could be places of religious labor. The order of preachers had not merely gained a famous member, it had gained a model of what its intellectual vocation could become. Yet Thomas's reputation did not rise without complication. The very Aristotelian confidence that made his work powerful also made parts of it suspect in some circles. In 1277, only 3 years after his death, the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tampier, issued condemnations of various philosophical and theological propositions associated with currents of Aristotelian thought. The condemnations were not a simple condemnation of Thomas as a whole, and their relation to his work has been carefully debated. Still, the climate shows that the questions he had handled so patiently did not become harmless after he died. Aristotle remained dangerous ground. Some of Thomas's positions were viewed with suspicion by certain theologians, especially where his use of Aristotelian categories seemed too bold. The 13th century had not settled the relation between philosophy and theology by accepting Aquinas at once. His synthesis, which later generations might treat as almost classical, first had to survive controversy. This is important because it prevents his story from becoming too smooth. Thomas did not die and immediately become the unquestioned voice of Catholic reason. His authority had to grow through dispute, teaching, correction, and reception. The Dominican order defended him. Students and followers copied, explained, and extended his work. His writings continued to circulate because they were useful. They answered questions with unusual order. They gave teachers a structure. They allowed readers to move from objection to reply, from philosophical difficulty to theological placement, from scattered authorities to arranged doctrine. A book survives in schools not only because it is admired, but because it can be taught. Thomas's work proved teachable across generations. Canonization gave his memory a new public standing. In 1323, Pope John II declared Thomas Aquinas a saint. This act did not make him important for the first time, but it placed official holiness around a reputation already growing. The man once detained by his family for joining a poor preaching order was now recognized by the Church as Saint Thomas Aquinas. The title joined sanctity to scholarship in a way that mattered deeply for the Dominican order and for the wider intellectual life of Catholic Christianity. His canonization also softened some earlier suspicions. A saint could still be interpreted, debated, and qualified, but his person now stood under a recognized honor. Theologians could disagree with Thomas on particular points, and many did, but his work increasingly became a central reference point. He was not the only medieval master. Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, Albert the Great, Anselm, Peter Lombard, Augustine, and many others remained part of the intellectual landscape. But Aquinas offered a breadth and order that made his writings especially suitable for long institutional use. Later centuries gave him titles that reflected his growing authority. He became known as the Angelic Doctor, a title that linked purity, intellect, and theological clarity in the language of devotion. Such titles can sometimes freeze a person into marble, and Thomas has often suffered from that kind of reverence. The living friar disappears behind the system. The family conflict, the student silence, the exhausting travel, the unfinished manuscript, and the final illness at Fossa Nova can vanish behind an image of perfect scholastic order. The fuller story restores the human life beneath the title. Thomism, the school of thought shaped by his work, did not remain a single unchanged thing. It developed through commentators, teachers, disputes, reforms, and institutional settings. Medieval followers read him one way. Early modern scholastics read him within new controversies. 19th century Catholic thinkers returned to him under different pressures. In 1879, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris encouraged a renewal of Thomistic philosophy, and Aquinas gained fresh prominence in seminaries and Catholic intellectual life. His thought became a language through which many tried to answer modern questions with medieval tools. That later revival shows how far Thomas traveled after death. A man who wrote in the manuscript culture of the 13th century became a central figure in printed textbooks, seminaries, papal documents, university courses, and philosophical debates far beyond the world he had known. His concepts of act and potency, essence and existence, natural law, virtue, analogy, and the relation of faith and reason entered arguments he could never have imagined. A Dominican master formed in Paris and Naples became a companion to readers facing worlds of science, politics, doubt, and modernity. Yet the endurance of Aquinas cannot be explained only by official approval. Many thinkers have been praised by institutions and then ignored by students. Thomas lasted because his work gave the mind a way to proceed. He did not answer every question later ages would ask, and some of his conclusions belong unmistakably to his own century, but the method remained fertile. State the difficulty, honor the authority, distinguish the meanings, answer with proportion, return to the objections. This discipline could be carried into questions beyond the ones he himself had placed on the page. His account of natural law became especially influential. The idea that human beings possess a rational participation in moral order, that law must be directed to the common good, and that authority is not merely will, continued to shape Catholic moral and political thought. These ideas were debated, revised, and applied in many settings. They were not always used wisely. No great thinker controls all later uses of his name, but the endurance of the language shows the depth of the structure he gave to questions of law, conscience, and human action. The relation of faith and reason remained another major part of his legacy. Thomas's confidence that truth could not finally contradict truth gave later Christian thinkers a model for engaging philosophy without fear. That confidence did not mean every philosophical claim should be accepted. Aquinas himself had corrected Aristotle where Christian doctrine required it. His deeper lesson lay in the patience of engagement. A difficult question was not a threat merely because it was difficult. It became a place where thought had to become more exact. Fossa Nova, then, was not an ending in the ordinary sense. It was the place where the living voice stopped and the long work of reception began. The Dominican friar no longer dictated. Reginald no longer waited for the next answer. The unfinished Summa no longer grew under Thomas's hand, but the manuscripts remained, and with them remained the order of a mind that had tried to teach others how to pass through difficulty without losing the unity of truth. In later classrooms, Thomas often appeared first as a name on a page. Students met him through articles and objections, through Latin phrases, through diagrams of the virtues, through arguments for God's existence, through questions about law, grace, being, and the soul. Some admired him, some resisted him, some found him too difficult, too systematic, or too bound to his age. Others found in him a steadiness that helped them think. The afterlife of a theologian is not made only of praise. It is made of continued reading. Aquinas' story began with family expectation and ended with a body cared for by monks. Between those points lay a life of obedience that repeatedly moved him away from what others might have planned. His family imagined one religious future. The Dominicans gave him another. The schools required argument. Aristotle required judgment. The church required teaching. His own final experience required silence. Each stage narrowed and widened him at the same time, taking away one path while opening another. The monk who tried to prove God did more than offer proofs. He tried to show that creation was intelligible, that reason had dignity, that revelation gave light reason could not produce for itself, and that the human mind could be trained to move patiently toward truth. His life did not end with the completion of that effort. It ended with the effort unfinished, which may be one reason it continued to speak. A completed system can become closed. An unfinished one leaves a quiet edge where later readers remain aware of the person who stopped. At Fossa Nova, the stones of the abbey held the last days of a Dominican who had crossed so many forms of religious life. Benedictine childhood, Dominican poverty, Parisian mastery, papal service, Neapolitan teaching, Cistercian care. The sequence did not erase its earlier parts. It gathered them. The old monastic world and the new mendicant world met around him at the end, not as rivals, but as houses within the same larger church. The final room did not need argument to make that clear. The centuries after Thomas carried his name into places far from Roccasecca. His books entered libraries where no one had seen the hills of southern Italy. His questions were copied by hands that knew him only as an authority. His arguments were spoken by teachers in schools he never visited. His hymns continued in worship. His account of law and virtue passed into moral traditions. His unfinished Summa remained open on desks, its pages asking the reader to begin where objections seemed strongest. Long after the council he never reached had ended, long after the kingdoms of his century had changed their names and borders, the work continued in quieter forms. A student bent over a manuscript, a friar prepared a lecture, a theologian marked a distinction in the margin, a line of chant carried Eucharistic doctrine through a chapel. Stone cooled in the cloister walks of old abbeys, and ink held its dark shape on parchment, waiting for another reader to follow the patient order of a mind that had fallen silent. The journey is complete. Rest well.